Hello, Night Seekers. Welcome to Black Screen Horror. Relax, close your eyes, and enjoy tonight's true scary stories with gentle rain. Where are you watching from tonight? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Sweet dreams if you dare. I was 10, maybe 11 when this happened, and it is one of those memories that never softened with time the way most childhood memories do. Most things from that age blur together for me now. Birthdays and school years and the names of teachers I once thought I would never forget. But this one stayed sharp. Every detail still exactly where I left it. Like my brain refused to let this particular memory fade even a little. I have tried, more than once, to convince myself that a child's memory can play tricks, that the years and the retellings must have exaggerated something that was probably much smaller and much more explainable at the time. But every time I ask another family member who was there, they describe the exact same details, in the exact same order, without me ever prompting them, and that consistency is somehow more unsettling to me than if everyone remembered it slightly differently. It happened at my great-grandfather's house, an old farmhouse on the edge of town that had been in our family for longer than anyone could tell me, with any real confidence. He had lived there for most of his life, first with his wife, my great-grandmother, and then, in the final stretch of his life, alone. She had passed away about a month or so before everything I'm about to describe took place, and the whole family had been taking turns visiting him ever since, checking in, bringing food, making sure he wasn't spending every hour of every day sitting alone in that big house with nothing but her absence keeping him company. He had loved her for over 60 years, and losing her seemed to hollow him out in a way that none of us really knew how to help with, no matter how often we visited or how many casseroles got left in his refrigerator. Not long after she died, he started telling people that he was seeing things around the house. Nothing dramatic at first, or at least nothing he described as dramatic. He would mention it almost casually, the way you'd mention noticing a draft from a window that didn't use to let one in. He said he kept catching movement out of the corner of his eye in rooms where nothing should have been moving, especially in the living room, where the old television sat against the far wall. The same television he and my great-grandmother used to watch the evening news on together every night for as long as anyone could remember. He said sometimes he would look toward the television, even when it was off, and feel like something was standing just behind him, close enough that he could sense it without being able to point to exactly what he was sensing. He described it a little differently every time he brought it up, which is part of why nobody in the family took it seriously at first. Sometimes he said it felt like someone had walked into the room right after he had, the way you can sometimes sense another person entering a space even before you turn to look at them. Other times, he said it was more like a change in temperature, a small patch of cold air near the television that never seemed to be there any other time of day. No matter how many times he checked the vents or asked my uncle to look at the old radiator in that corner of the room, he mentioned once that he had started leaving a lamp on in the living room overnight, something he and my great-grandmother had never done in all their years together, because sitting in that room in full darkness had started to feel unbearable to him in a way he couldn't fully put into words even to himself. Nobody in the family took him seriously. I want to be honest about that, because it matters for what happened later. He was in his late 80s by then, grieving hard, not sleeping well, and everyone quietly assumed his mind was starting to slip the way minds sometimes do at that age, especially under that kind of emotional weight. My parents would nod along politely whenever he brought it up during a visit, exchange a look with each other over his head, and gently change the subject to something easier, the weather, or what he'd had for lunch, or whether he needed anything from the store. Looking back, I think everyone genuinely believed they were being kind by not making a bigger deal out of it. Nobody wanted to frighten a grieving old man further by treating his fears as real, and nobody wanted to admit, even to themselves, that maybe there was something to what he was describing. My great-grandfather, though, was not the type of man who let himself be dismissed quietly. He had spent most of his life running his own small business, and if there was one thing about him that never changed, no matter how old he got, it was his stubbornness. If nobody was going to believe what he was seeing, he decided he was going to prove it himself. He still had an old Polaroid camera tucked away in a closet somewhere in the house. One of those instant cameras that spits out a square photograph that slowly develops itself in front of you over the course of a few minutes. He dug it out, found a couple of film packs still sitting in a drawer, and started walking around the house at odd hours, taking pictures of empty rooms, of doorways, of corners where he said he kept feeling like something was watching him. Most of the pictures came out completely normal. Empty rooms, empty hallways, the kind of slightly overexposed, slightly yellow-tinted photographs that old Polaroid cameras always seem to produce. Nothing unusual in any of them at all. He showed a handful of them to my parents on one of our visits, almost sheepishly, like even he wasn't entirely sure what he was hoping to prove anymore. And my parents looked through them politely and told him they looked fine, nothing there. Just an empty living room and an empty hallway and an empty kitchen. I remember him getting quiet after that. The kind of quiet that felt like disappointment more than anything else, like some small part of him had been hoping, against his own better judgment, that one of those pictures would finally make someone believe him. My mother told me later that she had gone with him on one of those photograph-taking sessions, mostly to keep him company and partly, I think, because she was worried about him wandering the house alone at odd hours in the state of mind he was in. She said he moved through each room slowly and deliberately, pausing in doorways and hallway corners for a moment before lifting the camera, almost like he was waiting for something to settle before he took the shot. She said the sound of that camera, the mechanical whir and click, followed by the photograph sliding out of the slot, seemed to genuinely unsettle him every single time, even though he was the one taking the pictures. He would stand there watching the square of film slowly develop in his hands, the gray blankness resolving into an image over the course of a minute or two, and she said his hands shook slightly every time, waiting to see what would appear. But there was one photograph that turned out differently, and that is the one that has stayed burned into my memory ever since, more clearly than almost anything else from my entire childhood. It was a picture of the television in his living room, taken sometime in the evening while the television itself was completely turned off. The screen dark and blank the way an old television screen goes when there's no power running through it. In the photograph, though, there was something on that dark screen that had no business being there. It looked, at first glance, like a shadow, the kind of vague, dark shape you might expect to see reflected faintly on any glass surface in a dimly lit room. But the second you actually looked closely at it, you could tell immediately that it wasn't a shadow at all, not in any normal sense of the word. A shadow doesn't have detail. A shadow doesn't have a shape that holds together the way this did. The shape in that photograph looked unmistakably like a person, or at least the outline of one, standing or perhaps hovering somewhere near the screen, tall enough to fill most of the vertical space of that boxy old television. But it wasn't a normal human outline, not even close. Both of its arms, hanging down at its sides in the photograph, ended in hands that had only 4 fingers each, long and distinct, every finger tapering to a sharp point at the very end. Nothing like a human hand at all, despite the overall shape being so unsettlingly close to one. And above where its head would have been, there was something that every single person in my family, without any prompting or discussion beforehand, immediately described the same way when they first saw the photograph. A halo. I want to be careful describing this part, because it is the detail that has stuck with me the hardest over the years. And I've thought about how to put it into words more times than I can count. It wasn't a halo the way you'd picture one from a painting in a church or a cartoon depiction of an angel, a simple glowing ring floating flat above a head. It was shaped more like a horseshoe, except instead of pointing downward the way a horseshoe normally does, it stretched horizontally from one shoulder to the other, arcing up and over where the top of the head should have been, connecting each end at shoulder height rather than sitting centered above like you'd expect. And inside that horseshoe shape, running along its curve, were a series of small, perfect triangles, evenly spaced, almost geometric in how precise they looked, like something had been deliberately etched or carved into that shape rather than randomly appearing there. I remember staring at those triangles for a long time when I first saw the photograph, trying to count them, trying to make sense of why something so deliberately patterned would show up in an old Polaroid photo of an empty room. The head itself, or what I assume was meant to be its head, sat below and inside that horseshoe shape, but it wasn't facing forward the way you would expect if something were simply standing in front of a television, looking out toward whoever was in the room with it. Instead, the head was turned almost completely to the side, facing to the right, so far to the side that in the photograph you could see what looked like the profile outline of it, a distinct curved edge running from where a forehead would be down to where a jaw would be, positioned as though it was looking at something else entirely in the room, something off to the side, something that wasn't the camera and wasn't whoever had been standing in the room taking the picture. That detail has always bothered me more than almost anything else about it. Whatever it wasn't looking at the person holding the camera. It was looking at something or someone else. The whole family ended up seeing that photograph, one by one, as word got around about what my great-grandfather had apparently managed to capture. I remember my aunt looking at it, her face going pale in a way I had genuinely never seen on an adult before that moment, and saying, almost under her breath, that it looks like a monster. I have never forgotten the exact way she said it, the particular shake in her voice, because up until that point in my life, adults in my family had always been the calm, steady presence in any room, the people who reassured you that nothing was wrong even when something clearly was. Watching my aunt's face go that pale over a single photograph taught me something about fear that I hadn't fully understood before that day. That even adults could be genuinely, visibly frightened by something they couldn't explain. I remember standing at the edge of the kitchen table where the photograph had been set down, too short to see it properly at first, having to be lifted up by my father so I could get a good look at what everyone else was already staring at in silence. I remember the room being unusually quiet for a house that normally had at least 3 conversations happening at once whenever the family gathered. Cousins running through the hallway, someone's radio playing in another room, the ordinary chaos of a big family visit. That day, once the photograph came out, all of that noise seemed to just stop, like someone had turned a dial down to nothing without anyone deciding to do it on purpose. I remember my own hands feeling cold, even though the house was warm. And I remember not wanting to look away from the photograph, even though every part of me wanted to. My great-grandfather, for his part, didn't seem shocked by the photograph at all, not the way the rest of us were. If anything, he seemed almost relieved, like he had finally been given proof of something he had known was true the entire time, even if the proof itself was as unsettling as the thing it depicted. He kept saying quietly that he told us, that he had been telling everyone for weeks and nobody had listened to him. There wasn't any satisfaction in the way he said it, though no sense of vindication or told you so. He just sounded tired and a little sad, like being right about something this frightening wasn't the kind of victory anyone actually wants. The photograph got passed around the family for a while after that, shown to relatives who hadn't been there the first time. Each new person reacting with roughly the same mixture of confusion and unease. Nobody had an explanation for it. My uncle, who worked with electronics for a living, examined it closely and said there was no obvious reason a screen that was completely powered off should have any kind of reflection or image on it at all, especially not one with that level of consistent detail. He turned the Polaroid over, checked the back, checked the edges, looking for some kind of double exposure or camera malfunction that might explain it away, but he never found anything that satisfied him. And eventually, he handed the photograph back, without offering any real theory at all, which for a man who always had an explanation for everything, felt like its own kind of confirmation that something about it genuinely didn't add up. Someone suggested taking it to a photography shop to have it looked at properly. Maybe get a second opinion from someone who understood old film cameras better than any of us did, but my great-grandfather refused almost immediately, in a way that surprised everyone given how eager he had been just days earlier to prove that what he was seeing was real. He said the photograph didn't need to leave the house, that it belonged there and should stay there, and something about the firmness in his voice when he said it made nobody push back on the idea any further. Looking back, I wonder if some part of him already sensed that the photograph, or whatever it depicted, was not something you wanted to carry out into the world and hand over to strangers. My great-grandfather passed away himself not long after that, only a handful of months later, still living in that same house, still surrounded by the same rooms he had spent his whole life in. I don't know if the things he said he was seeing continued right up until the end, because by that point, the adults in my family had stopped talking about it around us kids, the way adults do when they decide a subject has become too heavy for children to keep hearing about. I only know that he never seemed frightened of dying, not from what any of the adults told me afterward. If anything, some of them said he seemed almost ready for it, like whatever he had been sensing in that house over those final months had somehow made him more at peace with what was coming, rather than less. After the funeral, once the house had been mostly cleared out and the family started sorting through decades of belongings, someone remembered the photograph and asked my grandmother, his daughter, where it had ended up. We all assumed she would have kept it somewhere safe, tucked into a drawer or a photo album, given how strange and memorable it had been to every single person who had seen it. Instead, she told us she didn't know what we were talking about. At first, we thought she was joking, or maybe just tired from the funeral and not in the mood to dig through boxes looking for one old photograph among hundreds of others. But when we pressed her further, describing it in detail, the shadow on the dark screen, the four-fingered hands, the horseshoe-shaped halo with the triangles inside it, the head turned sideways. She just kept repeating the same thing, that she genuinely did not know what we were talking about, that she had never seen any photograph like that she couldn't recall her father ever mentioning a Polaroid camera or taking pictures around the house at all in those final months. Her denial wasn't angry or defensive, from what I remember. It was flat, almost distant. The kind of denial that didn't invite any further questions, delivered in a tone that made it clear the conversation was closed, whether we liked it or not. We never found that photograph. Nobody in the family has ever come across it since, not in any of the boxes that got sorted through after the house was eventually sold, not in any album, not tucked inside a book or a drawer the way old photographs sometimes turn up years later when you're least expecting them. It simply disappeared, Sometime between the day the whole family stood around passing it from hand to hand in that living room and the day we cleared the house out for good. And my grandmother, for her part, never once changed her story in all the years since. Every time it came up at a family gathering, and it did come up occasionally, usually late at night when everyone had had a little too much wine and someone brought up a strange family memory to fill the silence, she would give the exact same flat denial, word for word, like she had rehearsed it, like some part of her genuinely did not want to remember, or did not want the rest of us to keep remembering either. My mother has her own theory about what happened to it, one she has only ever mentioned to me privately, never in front of the rest of the family. She thinks my grandmother did find the photograph while clearing out her father's belongings, alone, probably in the days right after the funeral when she was going through his room by herself before anyone else arrived to help. My mother thinks she looked at it, remembered exactly what it showed and what her own father had said about it in his final months, and made the decision right then to destroy it quietly, rather than let it keep circulating through the family, coming up again and again at every gathering for years to come. My mother has never been able to prove any of that, of course, and my grandmother has gone to her own grave now, without ever admitting to anything different than what she told us that first day we asked. But my mother says she saw something shift in my grandmother's expression, just for a second, the very first time we described the photograph to her, before the flat denial settled back over her face like a curtain being drawn. I think about that a lot, honestly, more than I think about almost anything else from my childhood. I think about why an old woman who had just lost both her parents within the same year would choose to erase one single photograph so thoroughly from her own memory, if that's really what happened, rather than simply admitting she didn't want to talk about it anymore. I think about the way my great-grandfather looked almost relieved when the rest of us finally saw what he had been seeing all along, like being believed mattered more to him in that moment than being frightened did. And I think more than anything about that head turned sideways in the photograph, looking at something just out of frame that none of us could see, something that apparently only he had been able to sense in that house during those last lonely months after my great-grandmother passed away. I can still see it clearly whenever I close my eyes and let myself think about it long enough. The dark screen, the pale outline against it, the 4 sharp fingers on each hand, the strange horizontal horseshoe with its row of small perfect triangles arcing over where a head should have been facing forward, but wasn't. I've thought about drawing it out properly more than once over the years, sitting down with a pencil and trying to recreate it exactly the way I remember it, if only to have some version of that photograph exist again somewhere, since the original one seems to have vanished for good, whether by accident or by someone's deliberate choice. A few years ago at a cousin's wedding, 3 of us who had been there that day ended up talking about it again, off in a corner away from the music and the toasts, the way family conversations sometimes drift toward the strange and the unresolved once enough time has passed and enough wine has been poured. Each of us, separately, without comparing notes beforehand, described the exact same 4-fingered hands, the same sideways turned head, the same horseshoe shape stretching from shoulder to shoulder with its row of small triangles inside it. None of us had ever sat down together to agree on those details in advance. We had simply all carried the same picture in our heads for years, untouched by each other's memories, and hearing it confirmed so precisely by 2 other people who had been children in that room alongside me was somehow more disturbing than if I had simply been imagining it alone all this time. The old farmhouse itself was sold not long after my grandmother passed, bought by a young family who had no idea about any of this history, And as far as I know, nobody in that family has ever mentioned anything strange happening there. Maybe whatever my great-grandfather sensed in those final lonely months was something tied only to him. Something that came for him specifically in his grief and left once he was gone. Or maybe it is still there, patient, waiting for the next person in that house who finds themselves alone enough and quiet enough and close enough to whatever lies on the other side of everything the rest of us take for granted, to be able to see it clearly again the way he once did. To this day, none of us know what my great-grandfather was actually seeing in that house during those final weeks and months of his life. Whether it was grief taking a shape his mind could process, or whether it was something that had always been there in that old house. Something he only became able to perceive once his wife was gone, and some part of him had started to loosen its grip on the world the rest of us were still firmly standing in. I don't know if it had been waiting for her to go first, or if it had simply been waiting for him to be alone enough, quiet enough, close enough to whatever comes after, to finally be able to see it clearly. All I know is that for one brief moment, an old Polaroid camera managed to catch something none of us were ever supposed to see. Something that looked back at my great-grandfather from the dark screen of his own living room television, its head turned away from him towards something else in that house entirely. Something that, as far as any of us have ever been able to tell, was never captured on film again. I have had a handful of strange things happen to me over the years, small moments that I could always shrug off within a day or two once the sun came up and the world went back to feeling normal. But there is one night that never left me. And even now, years later, it still shows up in my head the second I close my eyes in a dark room, or the second a mirror catches me off guard in the corner of my vision. I want to write it down properly, not because I think putting it into words will finally help me forget it, but because I think somebody out there might understand what happened to me, or maybe has lived through something close to it themselves and never had a way to explain it either. This happened almost 4 years ago, near the end of a school year, during that stretch of exhausted, sleepless weeks that every college student knows too well. At the time, I was renting a room in an old shared house a few blocks from campus, the kind of place landlords buy up cheap and carve into as many bedrooms as they can legally get away with. The house had probably been standing for over 100 years. You could tell just by looking at it. With its uneven floors that sloped slightly toward the middle of every room, its window frames that had been painted over so many times the latches barely moved, and the smell that old houses get after decades of different families and different lives passing through the same walls. A smell like dust and wood and something faintly sweet underneath it that never quite goes away no matter how much anyone cleans. The house had 2 floors above a small, unfinished basement none of us used for anything except storing bikes and empty boxes, and a cramped, low-ceilinged attic room that nobody wanted. Because it turned into an oven in the summer and a freezer in the winter, and because the stairs leading up to it creaked in a way that made you feel like you were disturbing something every time you climbed them. I had a room on the 2nd floor, at the far end of a long hallway, and my roommate at the time, a good friend I had known since our first week on campus, had the room right beside mine. We had lucked into finding the place together through a mutual friend who graduated the year before, and honestly, for most of that year, living there felt like one of the best experiences of my life. The house was old and creaky and a little strange in the way all old houses are strange, but it never once felt unsafe. It felt lived in. It felt like somewhere you could leave your bedroom door cracked open at night without a second thought, and I did, most nights, because the sound of my roommate's television murmuring through the wall made the house feel less empty. Then, close to the end of that spring semester, something about the house changed. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like the kind of thing people say after the fact, once they already know something went wrong and they're trying to force meaning onto every small memory that came before it. But I promise you, all 6 of us who lived there noticed it independently, before anything actually happened, and only started comparing notes once we realized we were all feeling the same thing. Walking in through the front door in the evening started to give you this heavy, pressing feeling in your chest, like the air itself had gotten thicker, like something invisible was leaning its weight against you the second you crossed the threshold. We blamed it on stress. Finals were closing in. We were all running on burnt coffee and borrowed hours of sleep. And it made perfect sense that a house full of exhausted 20-year-olds would start to feel oppressive under all that pressure. Looking back, I think we wanted it to be that simple, because the alternative explanation was too uncomfortable to sit with for more than a few seconds at a time, and none of us were ready to say it out loud. I should walk you through the layout of the house before I go any further, because the geometry of the place matters for what happened to me, and I want you to be able to picture it the way I still picture it, whether I want to or not. The house was split into 2 wings connected by a narrow hallway that ran almost the entire length of the second floor, with a staircase cutting straight through the middle of it, splitting the hallway into a near side and a far side. My room and my roommate's room sat on one end, past the staircase, along with 2 other bedrooms that belonged to 2 guys we didn't know especially well. Quiet types who mostly kept to their own schedules and rarely came out of their rooms except to eat or leave for class. On the other end of the hallway were 2 more bedrooms belonging to the remaining 2 housemates, a couple who had been dating since freshman year and had somehow convinced our landlord to let them share what was technically supposed to be 2 separate rented rooms. The bathroom sat right in the middle of everything, directly across from the top of the staircase, shared between all 6 of us. And it was not a small bathroom by any stretch. Whoever had renovated the house decades earlier had clearly wanted it to feel almost like something out of an old hotel or a gym locker room, more space than a house that size really needed. When you walked in, you were immediately met with a long countertop running along the left wall, with 2 sinks built into it side by side, and a massive mirror mounted above them that stretched nearly the full length of the counter, edge to edge, floor to ceiling almost. Directly across from that, on the right wall, sat a second countertop with 2 more sinks and another wide mirror positioned exactly opposite the first, close enough and aligned well enough that if you stood at one sink and looked straight ahead, you would see your own reflection staring back from the mirror across the room, and behind that reflection, an endless tunnel of smaller and smaller versions of the same room, repeating and repeating into a point of light so far back it looked like it went on forever. My roommate used to joke about it being a portal every time we brushed our teeth side by side in the mornings, laughing about which one of us would get sucked in first, and none of us thought anything of it, not once, not for the entire year we lived there before that night. Past the sinks, the room opened into a second section, narrower than the first. On the left side sat 2 toilet stalls with old wooden doors that never quite closed flush against their frames, always leaving a thin gap you had to consciously ignore. On the right side were 2 shower stalls, separated from the rest of the bathroom by a thin partition wall and a plain white curtain each, no glass doors, just curtains hanging from metal rings that screeched faintly every time somebody pulled them shut. If you stood at the left row of sinks and a shower curtain happened to be pulled back even part way, you could see straight into that shower stall through the reflection in the mirror in front of you. If you stood at the right row of sinks instead, you'd catch a mirrored reflection of that same reflection, bounced back a second time by the mirror across from you, doubled and slightly distorted, the way images get when they're caught between 2 mirrors facing each other. The bathroom door itself was heavy and wooden, fitted with an old iron latch that never quite sat right in its frame, always swinging open a few inches on its own if nothing was propping it. Someone long before my time had wedged a thick rubber doorstop under it, and none of us ever bothered to move it, because forcing that door shut all the way took real, deliberate effort, more than any of us wanted to put in at 2 in the morning on our way to brush our teeth. On the night everything happened, I had been sitting at the kitchen table downstairs, studying for a final until almost 1 in the morning, running on the last dregs of an energy drink and whatever adrenaline a body has left after a full day of caffeine and stress. My roommate had gone to bed a couple hours earlier, and the rest of the house had gone quiet, the way it usually did once everyone finished their own version of the same nightly grind. I finally closed my laptop, climbed the stairs, and made my way to my room, deciding I would take a quick shower before trying to squeeze in a few hours of sleep ahead of my exam. I grabbed a change of clothes, my shampoo, and a towel from my room, and walked down the hallway toward the bathroom. Nobody else seemed to be up. The house had settled into that particular late-night silence that only old houses have, where every creak of the floorboards under your own feet sounds louder than it has any right to, and the quiet itself starts to feel like it has weight, like it's pressing against your eardrums instead of just being an absence of noise. I pushed open the bathroom door, stepped over the rubber wedge, and walked in. I set my folded clothes down on the right side counter, right next to the sink closest to the shower stalls, so that I could reach around the curtain and grab them once I was done rinsing off. Before turning on the water, I glanced up at the mirror in front of me, the way you do without really thinking about it, brushing a piece of hair back from my face out of pure habit. That is the moment everything changed, the moment my stomach dropped before my brain had even finished processing what I was looking at. Reflected in the mirror in front of me, past my own shoulder, deep in the layered reflection created by the two facing mirrors, there was something inside the far shower stall. The curtain on that stall was pulled about halfway open, and in the gap between the fabric and the tile wall, tucked far back into the mirrored distance, I could see something faintly shimmering, like heat rising off a summer road, except this had shape to it, a suggestion of form where there shouldn't have been anything at all. At first, I told myself it was just a trick of the fluorescent light buzzing overhead, or my own exhaustion catching up with me after a full day of instant coffee and barely 3 hours of sleep the night before. I looked away on purpose, told myself I was being ridiculous for standing frozen in front of a bathroom mirror at 1 in the morning, and reached down to turn the shower knob. When I looked back up, it was closer. I don't mean it had physically walked somewhere I could clearly track with my eyes. I mean that in the layered reflection, bouncing between the two mirrors. The shimmering shape had shifted from the furthest visible layer to the layer just before it, the way an image jumps between two mirrors set up to bounce endlessly off each other, skipping the space between one reflection and the next entirely, as if the distance in between didn't exist for it the way it existed for everything else in that room. My whole body went cold in a way I can't fully describe. A cold that started somewhere behind my ribs and spread outward until my fingers felt numb around the edge of the sink. I stood completely still, my hands still resting on the faucet, my eyes locked on the mirror, because some instinctual animal part of my brain understood, without needing to think it through, that turning around to look directly at the shower stall would be a mistake I could not take back. I told myself again that this was nothing, that I was letting stress and sleep deprivation and too much caffeine play tricks on my eyes. I have never in my life believed in ghosts or hauntings or anything of that nature, and even standing there, frozen, some stubborn, rational part of my brain kept insisting there had to be an explanation that made sense. But the shape moved again, closer this time, faster, jumping 2 layers instead of 1, the reflection warping and rippling with every shift, the way still water distorts when something breaks the surface from below. At that distance, I still couldn't make out real details, only that it appeared dark, and that the darkness seemed to move slightly as it shifted, like it was covered in something that stirred with its motion, hair or fabric. I honestly couldn't tell which, and some part of me didn't want to find out. I wanted to run. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn around and walk straight out of that bathroom and not stop until I was back in my own room with the door locked behind me. But my legs would not listen to me. I stood frozen at that sink, with the water still running behind me, staring into a mirror that was showing me something getting closer and closer to me from a shower stall I hadn't even turned my head to look at directly. Not once. It kept coming, layer by layer, each jump faster and sharper than the one before it, until it finally reached the reflection closest to my own. Close enough that for one single unbearable second, I saw it clearly. More clearly than I have ever wanted to see anything in my life. It was not covered in hair, the way I had first assumed from a distance. It was some kind of long, dark veil, hanging down from where its head should have been, past where its shoulders would be. And through certain parts of that veil, I could make out faint outlines underneath, almost like there was a face somewhere beneath the fabric. Though I could not tell you a single feature of that face even now, no matter how many times I've tried to force the memory back into focus. From what I could guess was its torso downward, it was simply solid black, without shape, without texture, without any detail at all, like someone had reached into the reflection itself and cut a hole clean through it, filling the space with absolute nothing. And the eyes. I saw the eyes for less than a second, but I have never once forgotten them, not for a single day since. They were black, completely and totally black. No white around them, no visible pupil. Nothing that should have caught or reflected the fluorescent light overhead at all, and yet somehow they seemed to glow anyway, a wrongness that my brain still refuses to process properly, even now, years later, whenever I try to picture it again in detail. That was the only clear look I ever got, and it lasted maybe a second, if that. Then every light in the bathroom cut out at once, all at the same moment, plunging the entire room into total, absolute darkness, and I heard the door slam shut behind me with a force that rattled the frame, even with that thick rubber doorstop wedged firmly underneath it. I couldn't see anything at all. I couldn't see the mirror in front of me, couldn't see the shower stall, couldn't even see my own hands when I raised them in front of my face out of pure reflex. I stumbled backward, trying to orient myself toward the door, trying desperately to remember which direction I had even been facing before the lights went out, and that's when the smell hit me. A thick, overwhelming, metallic smell, sudden and everywhere at once, like a butcher's shop, like something had been opened up right beside me in the dark. I remember reaching blindly for where I thought the door should be. I remember my fingers finding the old iron latch, cold under my palm. And then I don't remember anything else at all, not one single second more, until I woke up somewhere entirely different. The next thing I was aware of was waking up in a hospital bed, disoriented, with fluorescent light burning directly into my eyes and a heart monitor beeping steadily somewhere off to my side. According to one of my housemates, the guy whose room was closest to the bathroom, he had woken up sometime after 2 in the morning needing to use the toilet, and when he opened the bathroom door, he found it wide open, the lights back on like nothing at all had happened, and me collapsed on the floor of the shower stall, my shirt soaked through with blood from what turned out to be a severe, uncontrollable nosebleed, my whole body shaking uncontrollably. He said he tried talking to me, tried asking what happened, and the only thing I could manage to say back to him over and over was that it saw me, that it saw me, that it saw me. Like a stuck recording, I couldn't stop playing. He said I wasn't making any real sense beyond that I kept trying to crawl away from the mirror on the far wall like I physically could not stand to have it anywhere in my line of sight, flinching every time my eyes accidentally caught my own reflection in the glass. Eventually, he just called an ambulance, because nothing he tried seemed to calm me down even slightly. And he didn't know what else to do with a roommate who wouldn't stop shaking and wouldn't stop repeating the same 4 words. By the time my parents arrived at the hospital, hours later, worried sick and half convinced something catastrophic had happened, I was already sedated, drifting in and out of a heavy medicated sleep, catching only fragments of conversation between doctors and nurses that I could barely follow or hold on to. When I finally became coherent enough to have a real conversation with anyone, the doctors told me they suspected I had experienced some kind of seizure, possibly triggered by the combination of exhaustion, academic stress, and the stimulants I had been running on all semester just to keep up with my coursework. It sounded reasonable enough, and for a moment I wanted to believe it too, because a seizure was something with a name, something doctors understood and could treat and could explain to my parents in a way that made sense. But the tests told a different story entirely. They ran a full CT scan once I was stable enough to cooperate with the machines, and it came back completely, unremarkably clean. No sign of any seizure activity whatsoever, no abnormalities in my brain, nothing at all that would explain what had happened to me on that bathroom floor. There is no history of epilepsy anywhere in my family, going back as far as anyone can trace it, and I had taken the exact same stimulants plenty of times before that night, and plenty of times since, without a single hallucination or blackout to show for any of it. Whatever happened to me in that bathroom simply did not fit into any medical box the doctors had available to put it in. And after a few more days of tests that all came back equally clean, they eventually stopped trying to find an explanation and focused instead on just getting me stable enough to be discharged and sent home. I moved out of that house not long after finals ended that semester, technically because the lease was already coming to its natural end anyway, but honestly, if it hadn't been, I would have found some way to break it and leave early, regardless of the cost. I never once went back inside that bathroom again after that night. Not even to grab the few toiletries I had left behind in my rush to get out. I asked my roommate to collect the rest of my things for me instead, and she never asked too many questions about why, which I was grateful for at the time and still am now. To this day, 4 years later, I cannot stand being in a room with a mirror for more than a minute or two before my chest starts to tighten and my breathing turns shallow and uneven. If I'm stuck somewhere with a mirror for longer than that, a waiting room, a fitting room in a clothing store, anywhere with a reflective surface I can't easily avoid, I start to shake. And more than once, that shaking has turned into a full breakdown that left me curled up on some bathroom floor somewhere, a stranger's house or a public restroom, trying desperately to remember how to breathe normally again while people knocked on the door asking if I was okay. I've been in therapy for almost 3 years now, specifically because of that night, working through it slowly and painfully with a counselor who has stayed patient with me even during the sessions where I can't fully put into words what exactly I'm afraid of, or why a simple bathroom mirror can undo me so completely when nothing else in my life seems to trigger that same reaction. I've also spoken to a handful of religious leaders from a few different backgrounds over the years, hoping that someone, somewhere, might have an answer that actually made sense of what I went through. While they were all kind about it, gentle even, most of what I ever got back amounted to some version of turning to faith during difficult times, without anyone actually recognizing what I described in any concrete or specific way, without anyone giving me a name for what I saw, or a reason why it chose that bathroom, that mirror, that one particular night out of every night I had lived in that house before it. What makes the whole thing stranger to me, even now, is that nobody in that house had ever mentioned anything unusual happening before that spring. Not one single story about strange noises or bad feelings in that bathroom, even though some of my housemates had already been living there for nearly 2 full years before I ever moved in. And after I left, as far as I know from the 1 or 2 people I've stayed loosely in touch with, nothing else ever happened there again either. No one who moved in after us ever reported anything strange. No odd stories passed quietly down the way they usually do in old rental houses near a college campus. The kind of stories that get exaggerated and retold every year until nobody remembers what actually happened first. It was just that one night, one isolated event, contained entirely to those few unbearable minutes I spent standing at that sink with the water running behind me and my eyes locked on a mirror I should have looked away from the very second I first noticed something was wrong with it. I still don't have an explanation for what I saw looking back at me from that shower stall, layer after layer, closing the distance between us until there was nothing left separating me from it except a thin sheet of glass and a few feet of empty, humid bathroom air. I don't know what it wanted from me, or whether it wanted anything at all in any way I could understand, or whether I was simply unlucky enough to be standing in the wrong bathroom, inside the wrong old house. On the one single night, that particular door happened to be open to something it should never, under any circumstance, have been open to. All I know for certain is that whatever it was, it looked at me, directly at me. And for one unbearable second, I looked back, and some part of me has never quite managed to come back from that mirror since. No matter how much time passes, or how many therapists I sit across from trying to explain it. About 10 years ago, when I was 19, I had a close friend who was just as fascinated by the paranormal as I was. We spent a lot of our free time back then swapping stories, watching documentaries about haunted places, and occasionally trying out whatever ghost hunting equipment or spirit boards we could get our hands on, mostly just for fun, mostly never expecting anything real to actually happen. She was the one who eventually bought a spirit board. Not one of the standard mass-produced ones you'd find at any big box store, but a slightly different version called the Psychic Circle. It came with a large board covered in printed words, small photographs, and various symbols arranged around the edges, along with a thick little instruction book that explained how you were supposed to interpret whatever the pointer landed on, since the answers it gave weren't as simple as spelling out letters one at a time. For a long while, we didn't have much luck with it. We'd sit cross-legged on her bedroom floor with the lights dimmed, fingers resting lightly on the wooden pointer, waiting for something to happen, and mostly nothing ever did. Occasionally, the pointer would drift a little, and we'd get excited for a second. But deep down, we both knew it was probably just one of us pushing it, without meaning to. It became something of a running joke between us, the board that never worked. Then one night, she decided to take the board over to her aunt's house, mostly on a whim, since her aunt had expressed some interest in trying it out herself after hearing about it. I wasn't there for that particular session, so everything I know about what happened that night comes secondhand from my friend, told to me over the phone the next day in a voice that sounded different than usual, quieter, more careful with her words than she normally was. She told me that she and her aunt had sat down together with the board that evening, and that almost immediately, unlike every session the two of us had ever done together, The pointer had started moving on its own, smoothly and with purpose, spelling out things that neither of them claimed to have pushed. She wouldn't go into a lot of detail about exactly what was said, which in itself struck me as unusual, since she was normally the type of person who wanted to dissect every small detail of an experience like that for hours afterward. All she told me was that it had been intense, more intense than anything either of them had expected, and that by the end of it, her aunt had asked to keep the board for a few days so she could try using it on her own, without anyone else in the room. I remember pressing her a little on the phone that night, asking what exactly had made it feel so different from all the sessions we'd done together, curious whether it was the movement itself or something about what had actually come through. She hesitated for a long moment before answering, long enough that I thought the call might have dropped. And then she said only that her aunt had asked the board a question near the end of the session, something personal, something she hadn't told even my friend the exact wording of, and that whatever answer had come back through the pointer had made her aunt go quiet and pale in a way she wasn't used to seeing from her. She said her aunt hadn't wanted to keep talking about it after that, had simply packed the board carefully back into its box and asked, almost too calmly, whether she could hold on to it for a few days. My friend told me she hadn't felt like she could say no, given how unsettled her aunt had seemed, and some part of me wonders now whether that instinct to not push back, to just let her keep it, was the first small mistake in a chain of them that led to that Friday night. My friend agreed, left the board at her aunt's house, and we made plans to go back together that weekend, both of us hoping we might finally get the kind of real experience with it that had eluded us for so long. Looking back now, I think some small part of me should have paid closer attention to how quickly she'd agreed to leave something that had clearly rattled her. But at 19, curiosity tends to outweigh caution, more often than it should, and I was just as eager as she was to see what might happen when the three of us tried it together. That Friday night, I got into her car outside my house, ready for what I genuinely believed was going to be an exciting evening, and the moment I settled into the passenger seat and closed the door, a feeling of dread settled over me that I still can't fully explain, even now, a decade later. I want to be clear that this wasn't ordinary nervousness or excitement dressed up as fear. I had already had a handful of brushes with paranormal experiences over the years by that point in my life, strange enough that most people would probably find them unsettling, and none of those experiences had ever frightened me the way this feeling did. If anything, my past experiences had made me more curious than cautious, more drawn toward that kind of thing rather than repelled by it. But sitting in that car, watching my friend pull out of the driveway and head toward the highway, something in my chest tightened in a way that felt entirely different from curiosity. It felt like wrongness, plain and simple. A feeling that something about that specific night, that specific plan, was not something I should be doing, even though I couldn't have told you why if you'd asked me directly. I didn't say anything about it at first. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I was probably just picking up on some leftover nervous energy from my friend, who was clearly a little wound up herself after whatever had happened during that first session with her aunt. We talked about ordinary things on the drive over, music playing low from the radio, the kind of easy conversation two close friends fall into without even trying, and I did my best to push the feeling down and enjoy the evening the way I had been looking forward to all week. But the feeling never fully went away. It just sat there in the background the entire drive. A low, steady hum of wrongness underneath everything else. Her aunt's house sat a little ways outside of town, a modest single-story house set back from the road behind a row of overgrown hedges that hadn't been trimmed in what looked like a long while. It wasn't a particularly old or imposing house from the outside. Nothing about its appearance alone should have unsettled me the way it did. But the second we pulled into the driveway and I got my first proper look at it, the feeling of dread I'd been carrying since getting into the car sharpened into something much more specific and much harder to ignore. The porch light was on, casting a weak yellow glow across the front steps. And even from inside the car, I remember feeling like the house itself was somehow aware that we had arrived, in a way that made my skin prickle before I'd even opened the car door. I noticed, too, that all the curtains on the front windows were drawn shut, every single one of them. Despite it still being early evening with plenty of daylight left outside, and something about that small detail bothered me more than it probably should have. It felt less like ordinary privacy and more like the house had been deliberately sealed off from the outside, the way you'd close up a room you didn't want anyone looking into. We walked up to the front door together, and my friend knocked before letting herself in with the easy familiarity of someone who had spent plenty of time in that house growing up. Her aunt met us in the front hallway almost immediately, and I remember the exact expression on her face when her eyes landed on me for the first time that night. A flicker of something sharp and unfriendly that she didn't bother hiding nearly as well as I think she meant to. It wasn't the warm, welcoming greeting I had expected from someone I'd never personally met before, but had heard plenty of nice things about secondhand from my friend over the years. It felt more like being sized up by someone who had already decided, before I'd said a single word, that she didn't like what she was looking at. Stepping fully into the house made the feeling of dread even worse, intense enough now that I had to consciously work to keep my expression neutral and friendly, the way you do when you're trying not to let strangers see that something is bothering you. I told myself it was just nerves. Maybe some secondhand anxiety picked up from the tension I could sense between my friend and her aunt, or plain awkwardness from meeting a new adult who clearly wasn't thrilled to have me in her home. I smiled, said hello, tried to make the kind of small talk you make when you're a guest somewhere for the first time, complimenting the house, asking polite questions, doing everything I could to smooth over whatever strange energy seemed to be radiating off both the house and its owner. Her aunt led us into the dining room, where the board was already sitting on the table, still in its box, and I remember the particular way she handled that box as she opened it, almost reverently, like she was handling something far more delicate and significant than a piece of cardboard and printed paper. When she finally lifted the board out and set it down on the table between us, my friend let out an audible gasp beside me, and I understood why the second I got a proper look at it myself. The board looked absolutely nothing like it had the last time the two of us had used it together. It looked old, genuinely old, weathered in a way that made no sense given how recently my friend had bought it brand new from a specialty shop online. The once bright, saturated colors printed across its surface, the reds and golds and blues that had made the design look almost playful when we'd first opened the box together, had faded into dull, washed-out versions of themselves, the way fabric fades after years left out in direct sunlight. The edges of the board looked slightly warped, curling upward just barely at the corners, and there was a texture to the surface that hadn't been there before, faintly bumpy, almost like the material itself had been through some kind of physical stress that had changed its structure. My friend leaned forward, staring at it with a mixture of confusion and alarm clear on her face, and asked her aunt directly what had happened to the board, since she had left it in this woman's care only a few days earlier in pristine, brand-new condition. Her aunt's answer was short, delivered in a tone that didn't invite any follow-up questions, even though every part of me wanted to ask a dozen of them. She said the board had been sweating. Just that, nothing more, no further explanation offered, no context about what that phrase was even supposed to mean in relation to a piece of cardboard sitting inside a closed box in someone's home. My friend didn't push for more of an answer either, which surprised me a little, given how normally curious and persistent she could be about things like this. She just nodded slowly, like some part of her already understood exactly what her aunt meant, even if I didn't. Her aunt set the board fully on the table then, positioning it carefully between the three of us. And I noticed the way her eyes kept flicking toward me every few seconds, sharp and assessing. The same look she'd given me at the front door, except now it felt even more pointed, more deliberate. By this point, the dread I had been carrying since getting into the car earlier that evening had grown into something close to genuine fear, an unfamiliar sensation for me in situations like this, given how many times I had approached similar experiences with nothing but excitement in the past. My palms had gone clammy, and I could feel a faint, involuntary shake in my hands as I reached forward, along with my friend and her aunt, to place my fingertips lightly on the wooden pointer, resting in the center of the board. The second my fingers made contact with it, her aunt said one word, sharp and immediate, cutting through the quiet of the room like a slap. No, I pulled my hands back instantly, more out of startled reflex than any real understanding of what I'd done wrong, and looked up to find her aunt staring directly at me with an expression I still struggle to fully describe. Somewhere between suspicion and something closer to fear itself, though not fear of me exactly, more like fear on my behalf, or fear of what might happen if I stayed in contact with that board for even a moment longer. She told me flatly that they didn't like me, that whatever was on the other end of that board, whatever had been communicating with her during that first session with my friend, did not want to answer any questions while I had my hands anywhere near it. She said she could just tell, the same way you can tell certain things about a room or a person the second you walk in. An instinct that doesn't need proof or explanation to feel absolutely certain. I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me wanted to laugh it off, to make some joke about being unwelcome by an invisible audience, the kind of joke I might have made in any other situation to diffuse an awkward moment. But sitting there in that dining room, with the old weathered board in front of me and my friend's aunt staring at me like I was something dangerous that had wandered uninvited into her home, I couldn't find it in myself to make light of anything. The dread I'd felt since getting into the car that evening had settled fully into my chest by then, heavy and undeniable, and some part of me understood, without needing anyone to explain it further, that whatever had happened in that house during the days the board had been left there, it had changed something, and that change had decided, somehow, that I was not welcome to be part of whatever came next. We didn't stay much longer after that. The rest of the visit felt stiff and strained, my friend's aunt barely speaking beyond short, clipped sentences, her eyes rarely leaving me even when she wasn't looking at me directly, watching from the edges the way you watch something you don't fully trust. My friend tried to smooth things over a few times, attempting small talk, asking her aunt questions about her week, but the warmth that should have been there between two people who clearly cared about each other felt muted, overshadowed by whatever tension now sat in that room alongside the three of us. At one point, I excused myself to use the bathroom, mostly just to get a moment away from the weight of the dining room, and I remember standing at the sink afterward, looking at my own reflection under the harsh bathroom light, trying to convince myself that I was simply overtired and overreacting to an awkward social situation. But even alone in that small bathroom, with the door shut and the rest of the house quiet beyond it, the dread hadn't lifted at all. If anything, it felt sharper there, more concentrated, like the whole house was holding its breath around me. We left not long after, offering polite, hurried goodbyes at the front door, and I remember feeling an almost physical sense of relief the moment I stepped back outside into the cool night air, like some invisible weight had lifted off my shoulders the instant I crossed that threshold in the opposite direction. In the car on the way home, my friend was clearly upset, staring out the window for a long stretch before finally speaking, her voice tight with a kind of confusion I hadn't heard from her before. She told me that what had just happened back at her aunt's house was completely out of character, that she had never once seen her aunt act that way toward anyone, let alone a guest she was meeting for the first time. She said her aunt had always been warm and welcoming, the type of person who made everyone feel comfortable in her home within minutes of walking through the door, and that watching her behave with that level of open hostility and suspicion toward me had genuinely frightened her more than anything the board itself had done. I didn't have much to offer her in response, honestly, still trying to process the whole evening myself, though I remember reaching over at one point and squeezing her hand briefly, just to let her know I wasn't upset with her, since none of it had felt like her fault, whatever it actually was. My friend tried, over the following weeks, to get the board back from her aunt, wanting to bring it home so we could try using it together, just the two of us, the way we always had before. Her aunt refused, every single time, offering no real explanation beyond a vague insistence that it was better off staying where it was for now. Eventually, my friend stopped asking, and as far as I know, that particular board never left her aunt's house again. At least not while the two of them were still on speaking terms, and their relationship, from what I understood, grew noticeably more distant in the months that followed, for reasons neither of them ever fully explained to me. My friend mentioned once months later that she'd tried calling her aunt about something unrelated and the conversation had turned briefly, almost accidentally, back to that night, and that her aunt had simply said she didn't like to talk about it, in the same flat, closed-off tone she'd used when refusing to hand the board back over. Not willing to let the whole experience go without at least trying to understand it a little better, I ended up buying my own psychic circle board a few weeks later, ordering it from the same specialty shop my friend had originally used. I told myself I wanted to see if the board itself carried something significant, some property beyond whatever might have been specific to her aunt's house, or whether the experience we'd had that Friday night had simply been an unusual, unrepeatable fluke born out of tension and unfamiliar surroundings. My own board, when it arrived, looked exactly the way you'd expect a brand new board to look. Bright colors, crisp edges, nothing at all like the weathered, aged version I'd seen on that dining room table. I kept it in its box in my closet for almost a week before I worked up the nerve to actually take it out and try it, and even then, setting it up alone on my bedroom floor one night. I remember my hands trembling slightly in a way that surprised me, given how unfazed I'd always been by this kind of thing before that Friday night at her aunt's house. I tried using it a handful of times over the following months, alone and with a couple of other friends who were curious enough to give it a try, and just like the very first sessions my original friend and I had shared together, nothing ever happened. No unexplained movement, no strange messages, nothing beyond ordinary silence and the faint scrape of a wooden pointer sliding across smooth cardboard under our own hands. Eventually, I decided to take that as some kind of sign, though I couldn't have told you exactly what the sign was supposed to mean. And I gave the board away to a different pair of friends who seemed genuinely interested in trying it out for themselves. I never heard back from them about whether they'd had any luck with it, and I never asked, honestly, because some part of me had already decided I didn't especially want to know. To this day, I still don't have any real explanation for what happened in that house, or why her aunt reacted to me the way she did, so immediately and so certainly, based on nothing more than a feeling she claimed to just know was true. I've turned that Friday night over in my head more times than I can count over the past decade, trying to piece together some rational explanation for the dread I felt before we'd even arrived, for the state of that board, for the flat, unwavering certainty in her aunt's voice when she said they didn't want to answer my questions. I never got another chance to ask her more about it directly. My friend and her aunt drifted further and further apart over the years that followed, for reasons that were never fully explained to me, and eventually we lost touch with each other too, the way friendships sometimes do once enough time and distance settle in between two people who used to be close. I still think about that dining room sometimes, the faded, weathered board sitting under the dim light, and the particular way her aunt looked at me that night, like she could see something about me that I couldn't see myself, something that whatever was in that house had recognized immediately and wanted no part of. A few years after all of this, I ran into a mutual friend of ours at a grocery store, someone who had stayed loosely in touch with my old friend even after the two of us had drifted apart. And the conversation eventually turned to that whole strange chapter of our lives, the way it sometimes does when old acquaintances catch up on people they used to know well. She told me she'd heard, secondhand and unconfirmed, that my friend's aunt had eventually gotten rid of the house entirely, moving somewhere else a couple of states away not long after, and that nobody in the family really understood why, since she'd lived in that house for decades without ever mentioning any interest in leaving it. I don't know if that's true, and I've never been able to confirm it myself, but hearing it did something to that old feeling of dread I'd carried out of that dining room all those years ago, sharpening it back into focus after a long time of trying not to think about it at all. I still don't know what exactly the board told her aunt that first night, the question she asked, and the answer that came back through the pointer, the one that made her go pale and pack the board away so carefully before asking to keep it to herself. I've stopped trying to guess. Some part of me has decided, after 10 years of turning it over, that it's better left as one of those questions I never get an answer to, sitting quietly in the back of my mind alongside everything else about that house I never fully understood. When I was about 8 or 9 years old, my family lived in a house tucked into a small, hidden neighborhood at the end of a cul-de-sac, the kind of quiet residential pocket you'd only find if you already knew it was there, since it wasn't visible from the main road at all. The house itself was fairly ordinary from the outside, a single-story home with a garage that had been converted into a den at some point before we moved in, but the backyard was the real standout feature of the property. It was enormous, far bigger than any other yard on our street, stretching back so far that from the porch you could barely make out the tree line marking the edge of it. A line of tall, unkept trees that our parents always talked about clearing back one day, but never actually got around to during the years we lived there. My sisters and I spent most of our childhood summers out there, riding bikes in wide circles, setting up sprinklers, doing all the ordinary things kids do with that much open space to play in. Except for one corner. Tucked into the far back corner of that huge yard sat an old, rusted-out flatbed trailer, the kind people use to haul dirt bikes or lawn equipment, long since abandoned and left to rot in whatever previous owner had put it there. Nobody in my family ever used it or moved it. It just sat there, year after year, sinking slightly into the grass, its metal frame turning a deep, flaking orange-brown from years of exposure to rain and sun, weeds growing up thick through the gaps in its rusted flooring until you could barely tell where the trailer ended and the surrounding grass began. None of us kids ever went anywhere near that corner of the yard, not once, not even on a dare, which is saying something given how fearless kids usually are about testing boundaries their parents set for them. We never talked about it much amongst ourselves, never really articulated why, but there was an unspoken agreement between me and my two younger sisters that we simply did not go over there. Even our dog, a normally fearless mutt, who barked at literally everything that moved, including his own reflection in the sliding glass door, refused to go anywhere near that corner of the yard. He would trot happily across every other section of grass without hesitation. But the second his path brought him close to that trailer, he'd stop dead, ears back, and either circle wide around it or simply turn and head the other direction entirely. My parents used to joke about it sometimes, wondering out loud what could possibly be so interesting or so alarming about a rusted piece of junk sitting in the grass. But none of us kids ever found it funny, even when we laughed along politely. My two younger sisters shared a bedroom on the other side of the house from mine, and every so often, maybe once every couple of weeks, one or both of them would show up at my door in the middle of the night, asking if they could sleep in my room instead. When I asked why, they always gave some version of the same answer. They said there were weird lights in their room at night, lights that didn't belong there, flickering or moving in ways that didn't match anything either of them could point to as an obvious source. Sometimes they described the lights as small and darting, like fireflies trapped behind the walls, and other times they said it was more like a slow, steady glow that would appear near the closet door and then fade out again after a few minutes, only to reappear somewhere else in the room a little while later. They never seemed to agree completely on exactly what the lights looked like from one telling to the next, but they always agreed on the fact that the lights frightened them enough to leave their own beds and come find me instead, which for two younger sisters who normally fought over everything felt significant even at the time. My parents, when we brought it up at breakfast the next morning, always passed it off as nothing more than the street light outside their window, catching the blinds at a strange angle, or maybe headlights from a passing car, sweeping briefly across the ceiling as someone turned around in the cul-de-sac late at night. It was a reasonable enough explanation, and none of us pushed back on it too hard at the time, since kids generally trust their parents' explanations for things, especially when the alternative explanation is something you don't really want to think too hard about anyway. Looking back now as an adult, I realize that explanation never actually held up to scrutiny, since our cul-de-sac barely saw any traffic at all after dark, certainly not enough to explain lights appearing in their room on a regular, recurring basis. But at 8 or 9 years old, none of us thought to question it any further than that. I don't remember exactly how many times my sisters ended up in my room over those months we lived in that house, but I do remember, with a clarity that has never faded even after 20 years, the one night when something happened in my own room instead of theirs. A night that started out exactly like any other, quiet and unremarkable, right up until the moment it wasn't anymore. I woke up suddenly, without any clear reason, the way you sometimes do in the middle of the night for no obvious cause. But it wasn't just the ordinary disorientation of waking up in the dark. What woke me was a feeling, immediate and overwhelming. A feeling of pure, focused anger, directed straight at me. I don't know how else to describe it except to say that it felt exactly like standing next to someone who is furiously, murderously angry with you specifically. Close enough that you can feel the heat of that anger radiating off them, even without them saying a single word. It wasn't vague or diffused the way a bad dream sometimes leaves you feeling uneasy after you wake up. It was sharp, targeted, and unmistakably real, sitting heavy in the room around me the second my eyes opened. I remember my whole body going rigid under the blankets before I had even consciously registered why. Some deeper animal instinct picking up on the wrongness in the room a full second or two before my sleepy mind caught up with it. I looked toward my bedroom door, and there, standing in the doorway, was the dark, unmistakable shape of a person. I couldn't make out any features at all. No face, no clothing details, nothing beyond the basic silhouette of someone standing upright. Tall enough to fill most of the doorframe, broad enough across the shoulders that it seemed to block out what little light might otherwise have crept in from the hallway behind it. And near where the head of that shape should have been, floating in the darkness, was a single, small point of red light, glowing steadily, the exact way the tip of a lit cigarette glows when someone takes a slow drag off it in a dark room. Both of my parents smoked back then, so my first thought, still groggy with sleep, was that one of them had wandered into my doorway for some reason in the middle of the night. Maybe checking on me. Maybe just passing by on their way to somewhere else in the house. I sat up in bed and said quietly, "Mom, Dad," waiting for one of them to answer, to explain why they were standing silently in my doorway in the dark instead of just coming in or saying something back. There was no response. No sound at all, no shifting of weight, no clearing of a throat, nothing. And then, in the space of what felt like less than a second, both the shape and the small, red, glowing light were simply gone, vanished from the doorway entirely, leaving nothing behind but ordinary darkness and the low hum of the house settling around me the way houses always do at night. I didn't think. I just reacted, pulling the covers up and over my head as fast as my arms could move, curling myself into the tightest, smallest ball I could manage underneath them, the way small children do when they've convinced themselves that a blanket is somehow an effective barrier against whatever might be lurking in the dark beyond it. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears, and I lay there completely still, barely breathing, straining to listen for any sound in the room that might tell me whether I was still alone or not. I remember the specific texture of the blanket against my face in that moment. Remember focusing on that small, ordinary detail as hard as I could, as if paying attention to something so mundane might somehow anchor me back into a world where nothing else in the room could possibly be wrong. Then I felt it. A tug at the blankets, down near the foot of the bed, firm and deliberate, the unmistakable feeling of something pulling at the fabric covering my feet. I yanked the blankets back sharply, some instinct telling me to reclaim that lost inch of covering immediately. And almost the second I did, there was another tug, just as firm, just as deliberate, coming from the exact same spot. I was too terrified to move beyond that single reflexive pull, frozen in place under the blankets, my whole body rigid with fear. So I just held on to the fabric as tightly as I possibly could with both fists, refusing to let go, refusing to move, refusing to make any sound at all, as if staying perfectly still and silent might somehow make me invisible to whatever was down there at the foot of my bed. Eventually, the tugging stopped. I don't know how long I lay there afterward, frozen, listening, waiting for it to start again, my small body clenched so tight under the blankets that my muscles ached from the effort of holding still. At some point, exhaustion must have finally won out over fear, because I fell back asleep without ever really deciding to, the way children sometimes do even in the middle of being terrified, their bodies simply shutting down whether their minds are ready to relax or not. The next morning, I told my parents everything. The shape in the doorway, the red glowing light, the tugging at my blankets, all of it, expecting some kind of serious reaction, given how frightening it had all felt the night before. Both of them told me, calmly and matter-of-factly, that they had been asleep the entire night, neither one of them anywhere near my doorway, and that it must have simply been a nightmare, an unusually vivid one, but a nightmare all the same. I remember feeling a little frustrated by that answer, even at 8 or 9 years old, because it hadn't felt like a nightmare to me. Not the way my actual nightmares always felt, hazy and half remembered by the time I woke up. This had felt sharp, physical, undeniably real, in a way that dreams never quite managed to feel. But I didn't have the words at that age to argue the point any further, so I let it go, the way kids eventually let most things go when the adults around them insist there's nothing to worry about. I do remember asking my mother, a little hesitantly, whether she or Dad had maybe gotten up to smoke a cigarette somewhere in the house that night, thinking that might at least explain the red light, even if it didn't explain the rest. And she just shook her head and told me neither of them had left their bed. Not once, the whole night through. I remember lying awake that following night, too, sheets pulled up close, listening hard for any hint of another tug at the foot of my bed, though nothing ever came. Not that night or any night after it, for as long as we lived in that house. We moved out of that house a couple years later for reasons that had nothing to do with any of this. Just an ordinary relocation for my father's job. And life moved on the way it does. I mostly stopped thinking about that house at all as the years passed, filing the whole experience away under childhood nightmares and overactive imagination. The same category most people eventually file away their strangest childhood memories once enough time, and rational adult thinking has had a chance to smooth over the edges. I do remember, though, that on moving day, when the truck was mostly loaded and my parents were doing a final walkthrough of the empty rooms, I made a point of avoiding that back corner of the yard one last time, even though the trailer itself was staying behind with the property. Even though there was no logical reason left to be afraid of a patch of grass I was about to leave forever. Something in me still didn't want to get close to it, not even for one final look. But then, fast forward almost 20 years, and I started noticing something strange about my recurring dreams, a pattern I hadn't consciously connected to that old house until I really sat down and thought about it. I used to have nightmares, periodically, about that specific house. Not constantly, but often enough that I noticed the pattern over time. In these dreams, I would always be running down a staircase, even though the actual house had been entirely single-story with no stairs at all anywhere inside it, heading toward the corner of the den, the same room that had originally been our garage before it got converted. In my dreams, that corner of the den looked like a black hole, not metaphorically, but visually, an actual patch of pure, impossible darkness that seemed to pull at the edges of everything around it, warping the light near it the way a black hole is depicted in movies and documentaries. In the dream, I always knew, with the absolute certainty dreams sometimes give you, that if I got too close to that black hole, something evil waiting inside it would reach out and take me, and every single time, I would wake up right at the moment I got close enough to feel that pull tugging at me. I also had other dreams, less frequent but just as disturbing, about the other houses in that same old neighborhood. Dreams where I would be running from house to house, searching for help, only to discover, dream after dream, that every single house in that neighborhood was somehow evil in the same way. That if I ever actually made it inside one of them looking for safety, I would die there instead. I never fully understood the logic of those dreams. The way dream logic never quite makes sense once you try to explain it out loud, but the feeling attached to them was always the same, an inescapable, spreading wrongness that seemed to belong to the entire neighborhood rather than just our one house. Sometimes in those dreams, I would recognize specific houses from our old street, the one with the wraparound porch 2 doors down, or the one on the corner with the big oak tree in the front yard, and every single one of them, no matter how ordinary and welcoming they had looked in real life, carried that same certainty in the dream that stepping inside would be the last thing I ever did. The detail that finally made my skin crawl. The detail that took this whole thing from an old, half-forgotten childhood memory into something I genuinely couldn't explain away anymore, came one night a few years ago when my younger sister and I were sitting around the kitchen table with our mom, reminiscing about old houses we'd lived in over the years, the way families sometimes do during a long, relaxed evening with nothing else pressing to talk about. We had been talking for a while already about other, happier memories from that same era of our lives, favorite meals our mom used to cook, birthday parties we'd had in that huge backyard, before the conversation drifted, almost by accident, to that old house on the cul-de-sac. And almost offhandedly, my sister mentioned that she used to have recurring nightmares about it too. Nightmares she had never once described to me before, in all the years since we'd lived there. She described running down a staircase in her dreams, exactly the same detail I had always included in mine, despite the fact that the actual house we grew up in had never had a staircase anywhere inside it. In her version, though, she would end up running into the kitchen instead of the den, where she would find the cupboard doors opening and closing on their own, over and over, with no one touching them, a steady, rhythmic slamming that she said always made her feel like something was trying to get her attention, or trying to warn her about something else in the house. She said the sound of it, in the dream, was somehow worse than seeing anything outright. That steady wooden clap of cupboard doors slamming, shut one after another down the length of the kitchen counter, always just slightly out of rhythm with her own heartbeat as she stood frozen, listening to it. And in her dreams, just like mine, there was a man standing in the den, in roughly the same spot where I always saw that black hole waiting for me, watching, silent, never moving from that corner of the room, no matter how far away she tried to stay from him. None of us had ever discussed these dreams with each other before that night. Not once, not in 20 years. And yet, here we were, describing nearly identical recurring nightmares tied to the exact same house, complete with matching invented details, like a staircase that never existed in real life, appearing in both of our dreams independently, without either of us ever having compared notes beforehand. Our mom sat there listening to both of us describe our dreams back and forth, and I remember the color slowly draining from her face as she realized just how closely the two accounts lined up, matching each other detail for detail in ways that felt far beyond simple coincidence. At one point, she asked, quietly, almost like she didn't really want to know the answer, whether either of us had ever seen anyone else in our dreams, any other figures besides the man in the den, and my sister and I both went quiet for a moment, each of us apparently searching our memories for the same detail before slowly shaking our heads, since as far as either of us could recall, it had always just been the one figure, standing motionless in that same corner, waiting. Needless to say, all three of us were thoroughly unsettled by the end of that conversation, sitting around that kitchen table in a silence that none of us seemed eager to break. I've driven past that old house a handful of times since then, usually when visiting family still living in the general area. And every single time, without fail, I get a distinct, uncomfortable feeling the moment I turn into that little hidden neighborhood, well before I even reach the house itself. It's not quite the same sharp, focused dread I felt that one night as a child, waking up to that shape in my doorway and the small, red, glowing light hovering where a face should have been. But it's close enough, familiar enough, that I've never once been tempted to slow down and get a better look, let alone knock on the door and ask whoever lives there now whether they've ever noticed anything strange about that corner of the backyard, or about the way their dog behaves whenever it gets too close to it. Once, a couple of years ago, I actually did slow the car down as I passed, just enough to look past the side of the house toward the backyard, curious, despite myself, whether that old trailer was even still sitting back there after all these years, rusting away in the same forgotten corner. I couldn't see far enough to tell either way, and honestly, once I realized what I was doing, craning my neck to try and get a look at that yard again after everything, I sped back up and didn't try it a second time. I still don't have any real explanation for what happened in that house, or why two sisters who never once discussed their nightmares with each other over the course of 20 years somehow ended up describing the exact same recurring dream, down to details as specific and unusual as a staircase in a house that never had one. Sometimes I think about that old rusted trailer, sitting alone in the back corner of the yard, and I wonder whether whatever kept our dog from going near it, whatever kept the three of us kids from ever wandering over there, even as small children who normally tested every boundary our parents set, was somehow connected to the same presence that stood in my doorway that night, with its single, glowing red point of light, or the same figure that has stood, patient and unmoving, in the corner of both my sister's dreams and mine for the past 2 decades. I don't know if that neighborhood was built on top of something it shouldn't have been, some old burial ground, or some other piece of history nobody bothered looking into before pouring concrete and framing houses over it. The way people always half joke about when a place feels wrong in ways nobody can properly explain. All I know for certain is that something in that house noticed me that night, stood in my doorway long enough for me to speak to it before it vanished, and reached for me from the foot of my bed once I thought I'd hidden myself safely away from it, and whatever that something was. It seems to have followed both me and my sister, in one form or another, into our dreams for 20 years and counting since. My youngest sister, the one who wasn't part of that kitchen table conversation, moved out of state a few years back, and whenever the subject of that old house comes up at family gatherings now, she tends to go quiet, changing the subject fairly quickly, which the rest of us have learned to just let happen without pushing. I've never directly asked her whether she has her own version of the same dream, whether she too has stood at the top of a staircase that never existed, staring down into a den where something waited for her in the dark. Some part of me suspects that she does, based on the way her expression shifts whenever the house comes up, but some other part of me has decided I would rather not know for certain. The same way I've decided I would rather not slow my car down again the next time I happen to drive past that quiet, hidden cul-de-sac and feel that same old unease settle over me before I've even seen the house itself come into view. I was staying over at my girlfriend's place back when we were still together, lying in bed nursing a pretty rough hangover while she and her roommates were off at class for the morning. It wasn't an unusual situation for me at all. I practically had a second set of clothes in her closet by that point, and her roommates were used to seeing me shuffle around the house in various states of exhaustion, so nobody thought twice about me being there alone for a few hours while everyone else was out. The house itself was a fairly typical off-campus rental, the kind of place 4 or 5 college students split between them. Thin walls, mismatched furniture, a kitchen nobody ever fully cleaned, but it felt lived in and comfortable. The sort of place where you could sprawl out on the couch or crash in a bedroom without anyone making a big deal out of it. My girlfriend had a little Pomeranian, small and fluffy and constantly underfoot. The kind of dog that barked at everything and nothing with equal enthusiasm, mail carriers, squirrels outside the window, other dogs walking by 3 houses down, all of it got the same excited, high-pitched response. Her roommate, who was also her cousin, had a Chihuahua, a tiny, nervous little thing that spent most of its time curled up somewhere warm, only occasionally working up the energy to yap at something. Between the two of them, the house always had some level of background noise going on. Little claws skittering across the hardwood floors, the occasional short burst of barking whenever the mail dropped through the slot or a car door slammed outside. It was just part of the normal texture of the place. Background noise I'd learned to tune out entirely after spending enough mornings hungover on that couch or in that bed. I had gotten so used to it, in fact, that I could usually sleep straight through both dogs going off at once over something completely mundane, a delivery truck idling outside, a neighbor's cat wandering across the front lawn, without so much as stirring under the blankets. That morning, though, the noise coming from the hallway was different, immediately and unmistakably different, in a way that cut straight through my hangover and got me sitting up in bed before I'd even fully processed why. It wasn't the ordinary excited barking I was used to hearing from either dog. It was frantic, panicked yelping, sharp and desperate, the kind of sound that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up even before your brain has caught up to what might be causing it. Both dogs seemed to be making it at once, overlapping each other in a way that made the whole hallway sound like chaos. And it went on long enough, without settling down the way normal excitement usually does within a few seconds, that I knew something was actually wrong. I got up out of bed, still groggy, still nursing the dull ache behind my eyes from the night before, and made my way toward the bedroom door to see what was going on. I should mention, since it matters for what happened next, that I'm a fairly big guy, 6'1", athletic build, the kind of guy who's used to being the largest person in most rooms he walks into. I wasn't wearing anything except my boxers at the time, having rolled out of bed straight from sleep without bothering to grab clothes first, since I hadn't expected to need to deal with anything more urgent than finding some water and maybe a plate of greasy food to settle my stomach. My head was still pounding faintly with every step I took toward the door, the kind of dull, deep throb that makes even ordinary daylight feel a little too bright. And part of me, even as I reached for the doorknob, was still half hoping this was going to turn out to be nothing, some easily explained bit of dog nonsense I could shrug off and go straight back to bed from. I opened the bedroom door and stepped out into the hallway, and what I saw stopped me cold for a second, my sleep-addled brain scrambling to catch up with what was actually in front of me. There were two guys crouched down in the hallway, both of them with a rough, hardened look to them, the kind of look that immediately reads as unfamiliar and out of place in a house full of college students, and they were both physically holding the two dogs down, hands wrapped around their small bodies, clearly trying to keep them from making any more noise than they already had. Neither of them looked much older than I was, but there was something in the way they carried themselves, crouched low, moving with quick, jerky urgency, that made it instantly obvious these were not people who belonged casually hanging around in a college rental house on a Tuesday morning. For one brief, disorienting second, my mind tried to construct some innocent explanation for what I was looking at. Maybe they were friends of my girlfriends I hadn't met yet. Maybe they were here for some reason I just didn't know about. Some errand or delivery or favor that had nothing sinister behind it at all. I genuinely didn't know. And in that half second of confusion, not fully awake, not fully processing the situation, I just said the first thing that came to mind. "What's up?" I said it in a tone that came out far harsher and more aggressive than I meant it to, and honestly, it surprised even me in the moment, hearing my own voice come out that sharp and confrontational, without any real conscious decision behind it. I think some deeper, more animal part of my brain had already understood what my conscious mind hadn't quite caught up to yet. That these two men had no business being in that hallway, holding those dogs down, and that whatever calm, friendly explanation I'd been hoping for wasn't coming. The second those words left my mouth, both guys bolted. I mean that literally, immediately, without a second of hesitation or explanation, dropping the dogs and scrambling toward the back of the house, so fast it barely registered as movement. More like they simply weren't there anymore, a heartbeat after I'd spoken. I stood there in the hallway for a moment, my heart suddenly pounding, my hangover completely forgotten, replaced by a jolt of adrenaline that cleared my head faster than any amount of water or greasy food ever could have. I remember taking a step back into the bedroom, almost on reflex, some instinct telling me to get behind a closed door, to put something solid between myself and whatever had just happened, before my brain had even fully assembled the pieces into a coherent thought. I shut the bedroom door and just stood there for a second, my back against it, trying to process what I'd actually just witnessed. Two strange men, hardened-looking, definitely not friends of my girlfriend's, definitely not anyone who belonged in that house, crouched in the hallway holding down two panicking dogs, and then, bolting the instant I opened the door and spoke to them. It didn't take long for the pieces to click together into the only explanation that actually made sense. Somebody had broken into the house while I was asleep in the back bedroom, and if I hadn't gotten up when I did, if the dogs hadn't started panicking loud enough to wake me despite my hangover, there was no telling how long they might have been in there, or what exactly they'd been planning to take with them when they left. My hands were shaking a little by that point. Not from cold, since the house was plenty warm, but from the sheer speed at which the whole situation had shifted from ordinary Tuesday morning boredom into something that felt genuinely dangerous. Something I still hadn't fully wrapped my head around, even as I stood there catching my breath against the door. I moved to the bedroom window, still trying to get a handle on my own breathing, and looked out to check if I could see anything happening outside the house. That's when I spotted the Pomeranian, my girlfriend's little dog, trotting around loose in the front yard, clearly having gotten out of the house at some point during whatever chaos had just unfolded in that hallway. Seeing her out there alone, wandering around near the street with no leash and no owner in sight, sent a fresh wave of adrenaline through me. And for a second I debated whether to go straight outside after her or finish figuring out what was happening inside the house first. I gathered myself as best I could, standing there in nothing but my boxers, feeling both ridiculous and completely unconcerned with how ridiculous I looked given the circumstances, and opened the bedroom door again, moving more cautiously this time, checking the hallway in both directions before stepping out fully. I made my way through the rest of the house, room by room, checking behind doors, checking the kitchen, checking the back door that led out to the small fenced yard behind the house, trying to figure out both how they'd gotten in and whether they were actually gone or just hiding somewhere, waiting for another opportunity. As far as I could tell, moving through each room with my pulse still hammering in my ears, they were gone. No sign of either of them anywhere in the house. No sound of movement. Nothing except the eerie, too quiet stillness that follows immediately after something chaotic and dangerous has just happened, and then abruptly stopped. I checked the back door and found it slightly ajar, which gave me at least part of an answer as to how they'd gotten in, and more importantly, how they'd gotten back out. I stood there for a moment, looking at that door, imagining the two of them slipping out through it in whatever direction led away from the house fastest, probably cutting through the neighbor's yard or down toward the street where I couldn't see from the bedroom window. I remember feeling a strange, delayed kind of fear settle over me at that point. Worse in some ways than the initial jolt of adrenaline from finding them in the hallway, because now I had time to actually think about what could have happened if things had gone differently, if I hadn't woken up, if the dogs hadn't made enough noise, if I'd opened that door and one or both of them had reacted with something other than immediately fleeing. Once I was reasonably confident the house was actually clear, I went outside to deal with the Pomeranian. Still loose and wandering the front yard, sniffing around near the sidewalk like nothing at all unusual had just happened. Blissfully unaware of how close she'd come to disappearing entirely, along with whatever else those two men might have taken with them. It turned out the neighbors next door had already noticed her out there and had come over to try and corral her, standing near their own front steps watching her, with the kind of concerned, slightly bewildered expression you'd expect from people who'd just seen a small dog wandering loose and had no idea why. I explained briefly what had happened, still standing there in my boxers, adrenaline making the whole conversation feel strange and disjointed, and thanked them for keeping an eye on her while I figured out what else needed to happen. The Chihuahua, though, was nowhere to be found. I checked every room in the house again, more thoroughly this time, checked under beds, inside closets, behind the couch. Every spot a small, frightened dog might have wedged itself into after a terrifying encounter with two strangers, and there was simply no sign of her anywhere. My stomach dropped a little more with every room I checked and came up empty. It seemed obvious, painfully obvious, that the two men must have taken her with them when they fled, whether by accident scooped up in the panic of trying to escape or on purpose. Since small dogs like that can sometimes be sold or used for other purposes, I didn't want to think too hard about in that moment. I called my girlfriend right away, hands still not quite steady, and tried to explain what had happened as clearly as I could manage given how rattled I still was. My voice must have given away just how shaken I actually was, because she told me later that she'd known something was seriously wrong within the first few seconds of hearing me talk, well before I'd even gotten to the part about the two men in the hallway. She left class immediately, along with her roommate, the Chihuahua's actual owner, and her cousin, and they both got back to the house faster than I would have thought possible, given the distance from campus. I remember the look on her cousin's face when she walked through the front door and I had to tell her that her dog was missing. That small, sinking moment of dawning horror as the reality of what had happened settled over her the same way it had settled over me a couple hours earlier. We called the police, who came out and took a report, walked through the house checking for any obvious signs of what had been taken or disturbed, and confirmed what I'd already figured out on my own, that the back door had clearly been the point of entry, and that from what they could tell, it looked like the two men had likely been in the process of looking for anything valuable to grab when the dogs had started raising the alarm loud enough to draw my attention. The rest of that day was a blur of anxious waiting, phone calls to local shelters and neighbors, flyers hastily put together and printed out at the campus library. All of us fanning out around the neighborhood, asking anyone we came across whether they'd seen a small, frightened Chihuahua wandering loose anywhere nearby. I remember the particular kind of helplessness that settles over you in a situation like that. Knowing there's a real, immediate problem in front of you, but having almost no actual ability to fix it directly. Just waiting and hoping and checking your phone every few minutes for any sign of good news. We must have walked up and down every street within a half-mile radius of the house at least twice that afternoon, calling her name into backyards and under porches, stopping every stranger we passed to ask if they'd happened to see a small dog anywhere, and every time someone shook their head no, the knot in my stomach seemed to pull just a little tighter. It was late that same evening, well after the sun had gone down, and the search had started to feel less like an active effort and more like a slow, exhausting slog through empty streets, that my girlfriend's cousin and her boyfriend finally found the little dog, several streets over from the house, cowering under a parked car in someone's driveway, clearly exhausted and terrified, but physically unharmed. From what they described afterward, she'd bolted the second they got close enough to try and coax her out, taking off down the block before eventually letting herself be cornered against a fence a few houses further down, shaking so hard the whole time that her cousin said she could barely hold on to her at first without the dog trying to squirm free out of sheer panic. They carried her back to the house, wrapped tightly in a jacket, and I remember the wave of relief that went through the whole house the moment they walked back through the front door with her safely in their arms, everyone crowding around at once to check her over, to make sure nothing was wrong, to just hold her and reassure themselves that at least this one part of the day had ended the way. They'd been hoping it would since the moment I'd called with the news. In the days that followed, the house never quite went back to feeling the way it had before. My girlfriend and her roommates ended up having a new deadbolt installed on the back door within 48 hours, along with a cheap motion sensor light for the backyard that one of them ordered online the same night, arriving 2 days later and getting mounted above the door before the box had even finished being unpacked. Every one of them, my girlfriend included, started double and triple checking that door before leaving for class each morning, standing there for a few extra seconds, jiggling the handle, just to be sure it had actually caught, a habit that none of them had bothered with before, but that all of them kept up religiously for months afterward. I noticed it myself whenever I stayed over in the weeks that followed, this small, constant undercurrent of wariness running through the house that hadn't been there before. Conversations that would drift, without anyone really planning it, back toward that morning, rehashing the same details over and over, as if repeating them enough times might eventually make the whole thing make more sense than it did. Looking back on it now, years later, what stays with me most isn't actually the fear I felt in that hallway, standing there half-dressed and confused, watching two strangers scramble away the second I spoke to them. It's the thought of how differently that morning could have gone if I hadn't been staying over. If the dogs hadn't happened to make enough noise to cut through a hangover heavy enough that I'd normally have slept through almost anything short of a fire alarm. I think about how long those two men might have had free run of that house if there'd been nobody there at all, how much more they might have taken, whether they would have come back again another day once they realized nobody had been home to interrupt them the first time. I think, too, about how close that little chihuahua came to simply vanishing entirely, carried off in the chaos of two men fleeing a house they'd broken into, and how differently that particular thread of the story might have ended if her cousin and her boyfriend hadn't spent hours combing the neighborhood looking for her. I also remember, in the weeks right after, catching myself listening a little more carefully whenever I was alone in that house, even during the day, even with sunlight pouring through the windows and nothing at all out of the ordinary happening around me. Any unexpected sound, the house settling, a car pulling into the driveway next door, the mail slot clattering, would send a small, involuntary jolt through me before my brain caught up and reminded me there was nothing to actually worry about. It surprised me, honestly, how long that particular kind of alertness stuck around, given how physically unafraid I genuinely felt in the actual moment those two men had bolted from the hallway. It was only afterward, in the quiet, ordinary days that followed, that the fears seemed to properly catch up with me, arriving late and lingering far longer than I would have expected. My girlfriend and I didn't stay together much longer after that, for reasons that had nothing to do with what happened that day, the way relationships sometimes just run their course regardless of what else is going on around them. But I still think about that house sometimes, about the particular quality of that panicked barking cutting through my hangover, about the exact look on those two men's faces in the half-second before they bolted, a look I've never quite been able to fully describe to anyone who wasn't there to see it themselves. Something between surprise and pure animal fear. The look of two people who had expected an empty house and instead found themselves face to face with someone considerably larger than either of them, standing in a doorway in nothing but his boxers, sounding a lot angrier than he actually felt in that first disoriented moment. I've wondered more than once what might have happened if I'd been smaller or slower to wake up, or if I hadn't been staying over that particular morning at all. It's not something I like to think about for too long, but it's not something that's ever fully left me either. The memory of that hallway, those two dogs going frantic at exactly the right moment, and the sound of my own voice coming out harder and colder than I meant it to, right before two strangers turned and ran from a house that was never supposed to have anyone home to stop them. The police never ended up catching either of the two men, at least not that any of us ever heard about. There was no follow-up call, no photo lineup, Nothing beyond that initial report filed the day it happened, and eventually the whole thing just faded into the kind of unresolved question that never gets a proper answer. Filed away alongside every other unsolved small crime that happens in college neighborhoods and rarely ever gets the attention or resources to actually be tracked down. Part of me used to wonder, in the months right after, whether I'd ever pass either of them on the street somewhere without realizing it. Whether I'd recognize that particular look on their faces if I ever did. That half second of surprise and fear right before they turned and ran. What bothers me the most, if I'm being completely honest, is a detail I didn't think much about until weeks later, lying awake one night, replaying the whole thing in my head the way you sometimes do, with moments that never quite settle properly in your memory. When the police walked through the house that day, they didn't just note the back door as the point of entry. One of the officers pointed out, almost as an afterthought while filling out his report, that the door hadn't been forced. No broken lock, no splintered frame, nothing that suggested it had been kicked in or pried open the way you'd expect from a typical break-in. It had simply been unlocked, or left unlocked, and the two men had walked straight through it like they already knew it would be open. My girlfriend and her roommates swore up and down that they always locked that door before leaving for class, every single morning, without fail, and none of them had any explanation for why it wouldn't have been locked that particular day. Nobody ever figured out whether it was a genuine mistake, someone forgetting just that once, or whether those two men had somehow known, ahead of time, exactly which door to try and exactly when the house would be sitting there with nobody around to stop them except for one hungover guy who happened to still be asleep in the back bedroom. That question has never fully left me, even all these years later, whenever I happen to think back on that morning. Whether it was pure bad luck, one unlocked door on one ordinary Tuesday, or whether somebody out there had been watching that house closely enough to know exactly when it would be sitting empty, and simply hadn't counted on the one variable that ended up mattering most that day, a guy still asleep in the back bedroom, nursing a hangover, woken up at exactly the right moment by two small, frightened dogs who refused to stay quiet. This happened around 5 years ago, when I was 12 years old, right after my family and I moved from the United States to Querétaro, Mexico. My parents, my brother, and I had packed up our entire lives fairly suddenly, and since we didn't have a place of our own lined up yet in the city, my grandmother offered to let us stay with her for a while, in the same house where my mother had grown up decades earlier. It ended up being closer to 2 years than the few months we'd originally expected, and looking back now, that house is where most of my clearest memories from that whole period of my life took place. Both the ordinary ones and the one memory that still doesn't sit right with me, even after all this time. I still remember the specific disorientation of that first week living there, waking up in an unfamiliar room, hearing the sounds of a language I understood but hadn't grown up surrounded by every single day. Everything about my daily life shifted sideways all at once, and my grandmother's house becoming, almost by necessity, the one steady, unchanging anchor point in the middle of all that upheaval. My grandmother's house sat in an older, working-class neighborhood on the edge of the city, the kind of place with narrow streets, uneven sidewalks, and houses packed close together behind tall metal gates and walls topped with broken glass or coiled wire. A common enough sight in a lot of Mexican neighborhoods, but something that still felt unfamiliar and a little unsettling to me at first, coming from the quieter, more spread-out suburb we'd left behind in the United States. The house itself was old, built sometime many decades before I was born, with thick concrete walls that kept the inside cool even during the hottest parts of the day, narrow hallways, and a small interior courtyard near the back where my grandmother kept a handful of potted plants she tended to every morning without fail. It had a particular smell to it that I can still recall clearly even now. A mix of old stone, whatever she'd been cooking that day, and the faint mustiness that seems to settle into houses that have stood in the same spot for that many years. My room, which I shared with my brother during those 2 years, sat just off that inner courtyard, close enough that on quiet nights I could hear the wind moving through my grandmother's plants outside the window, a soft, rustling sound that became so familiar over time I barely noticed it anymore. Right up until the point in this story where I started noticing it far more than I wanted to. The neighborhood itself had a reputation, one my parents were quietly aware of from the moment we moved in, for not being the safest part of the city, especially after dark or in the very early morning hours before the sun had properly come up. My grandmother's house didn't have anywhere secure enough on the property to park our car overnight, so my mother had arranged for us to use a small, guarded parking lot about 2 blocks away. One of those informal setups you find in a lot of Latin American cities, a fenced-off patch of land with a night watchman who kept an eye on the handful of vehicles left there in exchange for a modest monthly fee. Every single school day, for those first couple of years living in that house, our routine was the same. We would wake up in the dark, get ready as quietly as we could so as not to disturb my grandmother, who was usually still asleep at that hour, and then walk the 2 blocks from her house to that parking lot at 5 o'clock in the morning, retrieve the car, and drive to school from there. My mother always insisted we walk close together during that stretch, my brother's hand in my father's, mine in hers, a habit she'd picked up almost immediately after we moved in, long before that morning by the tree ever happened, simply because of the neighborhood's reputation and the hour we were forced to be out on the street. I want to describe that walk properly, because the geography of it matters for what happened. Leaving my grandmother's house meant stepping out through a heavy metal gate set into the tall concrete wall that surrounded her small front yard. A gate that always made a distinct metallic groan when it swung open, loud enough in the pre-dawn silence that I sometimes worried it would wake the whole street. From there, the route to the parking lot took us down a narrow residential street lined with similar houses, most of them still dark at that hour, their own gates shut tight, occasionally passing a stray dog trotting along in the shadows or a lone street lamp buzzing weakly overhead. About halfway to the parking lot, the street opened up slightly, where a small, informal patch of undeveloped land sat between 2 properties, overgrown with weeds and a handful of scraggly trees that nobody seemed to be actively maintaining. The kind of empty lot you find scattered through older neighborhoods where a house once stood or was simply never built. We walked past that lot every single morning without incident, hundreds of times over those 2 years, until the one morning that changed how I've thought about that walk and that neighborhood, and even my grandmother's house itself ever since. We stepped out through my grandmother's gate at 5 o'clock, the street quiet and mostly dark except for the scattered orange glow of the street lamps, the air carrying that particular pre-dawn chill that Querétaro gets even in the middle of the year. My mother and I walked together, my father usually a few steps ahead with my younger brother, the 4 of us moving through our familiar route on autopilot the way you do with a walk you've done so many times it barely requires any conscious thought anymore. We were approaching that same empty lot with its handful of scraggly trees when my mother suddenly grabbed my arm and told me, in a low, urgent voice, to be quiet. I remember being genuinely confused in that moment, since nothing about the street looked any different than it did every other morning. I asked her, just as quietly, what was wrong, and instead of answering right away, she raised her other hand and pointed toward one of the trees in that empty lot, maybe 8 or 10 meters away from where we'd stopped walking. My father and brother were already a good distance further up the sidewalk by that point, oblivious to the fact that my mother and I had stopped moving entirely, both of us standing frozen in place, staring toward that same tree, waiting to see whether whatever had made her react that way would show itself again. At first, I didn't see anything unusual at all, just the dark, familiar shape of the tree against the slightly lighter sky, beginning to lighten toward dawn behind it. But then, from behind the trunk of that tree, a small shape poked its head out, peeking around the edge in a motion that, for one brief, disarming second, looked almost playful, the way a little kid might peek around a corner while playing hide-and-seek, testing whether you'd noticed them yet. It was not a little kid. The shape that had poked out from behind that tree had a small, gray head with two large, dark eyes that seemed to take up a disproportionate amount of its face, and two distinctly pointed ears, or at least what looked like ears, positioned high on either side of its head. Its proportions were all wrong for a child. The head slightly too large for the rest of what little I could see of its body. The skin, if that's even the right word for it, a uniform gray tone that didn't catch the dim, early morning light the way human skin does. It stayed there for a few seconds, peering out at the two of us from behind that tree trunk, and I remember the specific, unnerving sensation of feeling watched by something that clearly knew we had already seen it. That wasn't hiding out of fear or shyness so much as some deliberate, curious kind of observation, testing our reaction the same way you might test whether an animal was going to bolt. If you got too close, I remember, too, how completely silent the whole moment was. No sound at all coming from the creature itself. None of the ordinary rustling or crunching of dried leaves you'd expect from anything moving around near that tree. Just a kind of unnatural stillness in the air around it that made the whole encounter feel wrong in a way I couldn't fully put into words at 12 years old, and still struggle to put into words now. My mother didn't say another word. She grabbed my hand, tightly enough that I remember it slightly hurting, and started pulling me in the opposite direction, away from that lot, toward a different stretch of sidewalk that took us the long way around toward the parking lot, instead of continuing straight past the tree the way we normally would have. I glanced back over my shoulder as she pulled me along, and that's when I saw the creature move fully out from behind the tree and take off running in the opposite direction from us, quick and low to the ground, disappearing somewhere into the deeper shadows of that empty lot before I could get any clearer look at it. I remember the specific sound of my mother's breathing beside me during those extra few minutes it took to walk the longer route, quick and shallow in a way I'd never heard from her before, and the way her grip on my hand didn't loosen even once we'd put a good distance between ourselves and that lot. Not until we could actually see the guarded parking lot ahead of us, with its dim security light, glowing over the gate. Neither of us said anything for the rest of that walk to the parking lot. My father and brother, who had been a little ahead of us and hadn't noticed anything at all, kept walking normally, oblivious to whatever had just happened behind them, and my mother didn't call out to explain to them what she'd seen, not right away. Not until we were all safely inside the car with the doors shut and locked. Even then, she only gave my father a brief, quiet summary. Something about seeing something strange by the empty lot. And he responded with the kind of tired, slightly dismissive reassurance parents give at 5 in the morning when they're more focused on getting to work on time than on unpacking a strange story. Telling her it was probably just a stray dog or a neighborhood cat catching the light in a weird way. My mother didn't argue the point with him in that moment, but I remember the look on her face in the rearview mirror as we drove away, and it wasn't the look of someone who believed she'd seen a stray dog. I sat in the back seat next to my brother, who chattered on about something completely unrelated for the rest of the drive to school, and I remember staring out the window the entire way, half expecting to see that same small gray shape somewhere along the road, even though logically I knew there was no reason it would still be anywhere near us by then. That night, back at my grandmother's house, my mother finally told me more clearly what she thought she'd seen. Sitting with me quietly in the small kitchen after everyone else had gone to bed, the house settled into the particular deep, heavy silence old concrete houses seem to have after dark, thick walls swallowing up most outside noise, until it feels like the whole street beyond the gate has simply ceased to exist. She said she'd caught movement out of the corner of her eye first, before I had even noticed anything, and that something about the way it moved, low and quick and deliberate, had made her stomach drop instantly, some instinct kicking in before her conscious mind had even fully registered what she was looking at. She told me she didn't want to frighten me, but that she also didn't want me to think I had imagined what I'd seen either, because she had seen it too, clear as anything, and it hadn't looked like any animal she'd ever encountered before. Not a stray dog, not a cat, not anything with a shape that made sense for that neighborhood. I remember the kitchen light overhead buzzing faintly the way it always did, and how strange it felt to be having that particular conversation in that particular room. A space that had always felt so completely ordinary to me before that night. My grandmother's worn wooden table, the same chipped mugs hanging from hooks above the counter. All of it suddenly carrying a slightly different weight now that we were sitting there discussing something neither of us had a name for. For the rest of the time we lived in that house, my grandmother's house, that walked to the parking lot every morning felt different than it had before. I found myself watching that empty lot more closely every time we passed it, half expecting to see that same small gray shape peeking out from behind the same tree, even though it never happened again, not once. In all the remaining months and eventually years, we continued making that same walk at 5 in the morning. My mother, too, I noticed, always seemed to walk a little faster past that particular stretch of sidewalk, angling us slightly wider around the lot, without ever fully explaining why to my father or my brother, who never did learn the full story of what had actually happened that morning. At least, not from us, directly. Even years later, whenever the two of us happened to talk about that period of our lives, that stretch of sidewalk always came up in the same careful, slightly clipped way. Neither of us lingering on it for too long. Both of us seeming to silently agree that it was a subject better handled briefly than examined too closely. There was something else, too. Something I only really connected to that morning much later, once I'd had time to think about it properly. In the weeks that followed the sighting, my grandmother mentioned, almost offhandedly one evening, while we were all sitting in her small living room after dinner, that she'd been hearing strange scratching sounds coming from somewhere near the back of the house at night, close to that little interior courtyard where she kept her plants. She said it had been going on for a while, longer than she'd actually let on to my mother, and that she'd assumed it was probably a stray cat or a rat getting into the courtyard somehow, the way small animals sometimes do in older houses with gaps and cracks that build up over the decades. She didn't seem particularly alarmed about it at the time, treating it as an ordinary household nuisance rather than anything worth worrying over. But I remember the specific chill that ran through me hearing her mention it that night, so soon after what my mother and I had seen by that tree. Close enough in timing that I couldn't help but wonder, even at 12 years old, whether the two things were somehow connected. Once my grandmother mentioned those sounds, I started noticing them myself, on nights when I happened to still be awake late enough to catch them. Lying in bed with my brother already asleep in the bunk above me, I would sometimes hear a faint, dry, scraping noise drifting in through the gap under our bedroom window, the one that looked out onto the edge of that same interior courtyard my grandmother tended every morning. It never lasted long, just a few seconds of that scratching sound, sometimes followed by a longer stretch of silence, sometimes followed by what I convinced myself was simply the wind moving through the leaves of her potted plants outside. There was one night, in particular, that stands out more clearly than the others, when the sound seemed to pause directly beneath our window for what felt like far longer than usual, a slow, deliberate scrape followed by silence. Then another scrape, almost as if whatever was making it had stopped moving and was simply sitting there, close enough on the other side of that thin pane of glass that I remember holding my breath without meaning to, waiting for it to either move on or do something else entirely. I never once got up to check, not during those 2 years we lived there, some part of me deciding, without ever fully articulating it even to myself, that whatever was making that sound was better left undisturbed on the other side of that window rather than confronted directly. I'd pull the blanket up a little higher on those nights, turn onto my other side facing away from the window, and eventually manage to fall back asleep. The same way I imagine most kids manage to convince themselves that an unexplained nighttime noise is nothing worth losing sleep over, right up until the moment something finally forces them to think about it differently. I never told my grandmother about what we'd seen that morning, and my mother never did either, as far as I know. I think some unspoken part of both of us had decided that bringing it up would only worry her without actually accomplishing anything useful, and so the scratching sounds near the courtyard just became one of those small, half-explained household mysteries that got mentioned occasionally and then quietly dropped again, the kind of thing every old house seems to accumulate over the years without anyone ever getting a satisfying answer for it. The sounds eventually stopped being mentioned at all after a while, whether because they actually stopped happening or because my grandmother simply got used to them the way people get used to any small, unexplained quirk of an old, familiar house. I never found out for certain. Looking back, I sometimes wonder if my grandmother knew more than she ever let on, whether some part of her had already drawn her own quiet conclusions about those sounds long before either my mother or I ever said a single word to her about the tree, and simply chose, the way people who have lived a long time in one place often do, not to give voice to a fear she couldn't do anything about anyway. About 3 years after that morning, long after we had finally moved out of my grandmother's house and into a place of our own, I was doing some unrelated research online for a school project when I stumbled across an article describing something called the Kelly Hopkinsville encounter, a well-known and heavily documented case from the United States involving a family who reported repeated sightings of small, gray, large-eyed creatures around their rural farmhouse over the course of a single terrifying night back in the 1950s. Reading through the description of those creatures, the gray skin, the disproportionately large eyes, the general size and shape of them, sent a genuine chill down my spine. Because it matched, almost exactly, in every detail I could recall, what my mother and I had seen peeking out from behind that tree so many years earlier. I sat there reading through the details of that old case for close to an hour. The metallic skin tone, the exaggerated eyes, the accounts of the creatures moving low and quick around the family's property throughout the night, and every new detail I came across seemed to line up a little more closely with the fragments of memory I'd carried with me since that morning outside my grandmother's house. I remember sitting there at my computer for a long time afterward, just staring at the images accompanying the article, feeling a strange mixture of validation and renewed unease, like some small, half-buried memory I'd mostly convinced myself I must have misremembered over the years had suddenly been handed a name and a history that made it feel undeniably real again. I brought the article up with my mother not long after finding it, showing her the description on my phone, and I watched her face carefully as she read through it. She didn't say much at first, just nodded slowly, her expression tightening in a way that told me she was thinking back to that same morning I was thinking about. Eventually, she said, quietly, that it looked close enough to what we'd seen, that it made her uncomfortable to keep reading, and she handed my phone back to me without finishing the rest of the article. I asked her, a little hesitantly, whether she thought there was any connection between what we'd seen and the scratching sounds our grandmother used to mention. And she was quiet for a long moment before answering, finally saying only that she'd wondered the same thing herself over the years, more than once, without ever landing on any answer that actually satisfied her. I can swear, even now, 5 years removed from that morning, that what my mother and I saw peeking out from behind that tree on our walk to the parking lot was not a stray dog, not a cat, not any ordinary animal that belongs in a residential neighborhood in central Mexico. I know how it sounds, and I know how easy it would be for someone who wasn't there to write the whole thing off as two tired people, half asleep at 5 in the morning, misinterpreting a shadow or a stray animal moving strangely in poor light. But my mother saw it too, clearly enough to grab my hand and pull me in another direction, without a second of hesitation. Clearly enough that the memory of it still visibly unsettles her whenever it comes up, even all these years later. And I still think, more often than I probably should, about those scratching sounds my grandmother mentioned hearing near her courtyard in the weeks that followed, sounds that started around the same time we saw that creature and eventually faded away without any explanation. In a house that had stood on that same quiet street for decades before we ever moved in, and that, as far as I know, has never had anything like that happen again since. My grandmother is still alive and still lives in that same house, and my family visits her every so often when we're back in the city for holidays or family gatherings. I've walked past that old gate more than a few times since we moved out, and every time, without fail, I find myself glancing toward the back of the house, toward that little interior courtyard visible through the kitchen window, half wondering whether that faint scratching sound would still be there if I stood still and listened long enough, late at night, the way I used to as a kid lying in bed a few feet from that same window. I've never actually tested it. Some part of me, even now as an adult, still prefers not knowing for certain. The same way some part of my 12-year-old self decided, that morning by the tree, that it was better to keep walking than to look back for too long. My grandparents, for whatever reason, had this strange, consistent habit of always ending up in haunted houses. It wasn't something they ever did on purpose, as far as I know. They weren't the type of people who went looking for strange or unusual properties. No interest in old Victorian houses with a reputation or anything like that. They just moved around over the years the way a lot of people their age eventually do. Downsizing once, relocating for family, settling somewhere new after retirement, and somehow, every single time, whatever house they ended up in would start producing the same kind of low-level, persistent paranormal activity within a year or two of them moving in. None of the houses were particularly creepy looking from the outside, nothing you'd point to and immediately think haunted house. Just ordinary suburban homes, the kind you'd see on any quiet street in any quiet neighborhood. But something about each of them, once my grandparents settled in, always seemed to wake up. It became such a running theme in our family that eventually nobody even reacted much when a new story came up. My mother or one of my aunts mentioning some new odd occurrence at the latest house, almost the same way you'd mention a leaky faucet or a squeaky floorboard. An inconvenience worth noting, but not worth losing too much sleep over. I could tell you a handful of stories from over the years, honestly. Different houses, different strange little incidents that built up into a kind of running family joke about my grandparents' unusual luck with real estate. There was the house with the kitchen light that used to flicker every night at almost exactly the same time, regardless of whether the wiring had been checked and rechecked by an electrician who never found anything wrong with it. There was the one before that, where my aunt swore she used to hear someone humming softly from an empty back bedroom whenever she stayed over as a teenager. a tune none of us ever recognized, stopping the instant she opened the door to check. Each house seemed to have its own particular flavor of strangeness, its own signature quirk that eventually became so familiar to whoever was living there that it stopped feeling frightening and started feeling almost like just another feature of the house, the way you'd get used to a drafty window or a door that's stuck in humid weather. But I want to focus on the one experience that actually happened directly to me. During one particular summer vacation when I was around 13 or 14 years old, staying with them for a few weeks the way I did most summers growing up. That house, the one where this happened, was a single-story home in a quiet residential neighborhood. Nothing unusual about it structurally. A straightforward layout with a long central hallway connecting the bedrooms. My grandparents' room sat at one end of that hallway, and the guest room where I always stayed during my visits sat at the other end, directly across from theirs, with the rest of the house branching off in between, a bathroom, a linen closet, and near the middle of the hallway, a cupboard where my grandfather kept a whole assortment of things, including his bottle of Tums, which he apparently needed fairly regularly given how often I ended up hearing him make that particular trip down the hallway at night. The house had that particular smell older houses often develop, a mixture of my grandmother's cooking, the specific brand of fabric softener she always used, and something underneath it that never quite had a name. A smell that instantly took me back to countless earlier summer visits. The moment I walked in the front door each time. At that age, I was very much a stay up late, eat too much junk food, play video games until my eyes hurt kind of kid, especially during summer vacation when there was no school schedule forcing any kind of reasonable bedtime. Because of that habit, I was awake at hours most of the rest of the house wasn't, and the guest room I stayed in had thin enough walls and a close enough proximity to the hallway that I could actually feel, more than hear at first, the faint vibration of footsteps moving across the carpet whenever someone walked past my door. It became a familiar, almost comforting background rhythm over the course of that summer, something I picked up on without really trying to. The same way you eventually memorize the specific creak of a particular stair or the hum of a particular appliance in any house you spend enough time in. Most nights that summer followed roughly the same shape. Hours spent hunched in front of whatever game I was playing at the time. Snack wrappers slowly accumulating on the nightstand, the television or handheld screen the only light in the room, and somewhere in the background of all of it, that familiar rhythm of footsteps passing my door once, sometimes twice, before the house finally went fully quiet for the rest of the night. The pattern was always the same whenever it was actually my grandfather. I would feel and hear the soft, steady sound of feet moving across carpet, starting from his end of the hallway, making their way down toward the middle where that cupboard with his Tums sat. A brief pause there while he presumably got the bottle open and shook a couple out into his hand. And then the same steady footsteps heading back the way they'd come, finishing with the soft, distinct sound of his bedroom door clicking shut behind him. It was such a consistent, recognizable little routine that I stopped paying it any real attention after the first week or so of that visit, filing it away as just one more ordinary nighttime sound in a house that otherwise felt completely normal and safe. No different from the hum of the air conditioner kicking on or the occasional distant bark of a neighborhood dog carrying through the summer. Night air. Then I started noticing something didn't quite add up. Randomly throughout different nights that summer, I would hear those same footsteps, that same familiar sound of feet moving across carpet down the hallway, except the timing felt off in a way I couldn't immediately explain. If it happened any later than around 1 in the morning, later than my grandfather's usual antacid runs typically occurred based on the pattern I'd already picked up on, I would get curious enough to open my bedroom door and check the hallway myself. And there would be nobody there. Just an empty hallway, dark and silent. Nothing to explain the footsteps I'd clearly heard moving through it only seconds earlier. The first time it happened, I genuinely didn't think much of it, chalking it up to my own drowsiness or some trick of the darkness. But by the third or fourth time, that easy explanation had started to feel a lot less convincing than it did at first. At first, staying reasonably rational about the whole thing, I told myself my grandfather must have simply made it back into his bedroom faster than I expected, that I was probably a beat or two slow reacting to the sound and missing him by a matter of seconds each time. So I adjusted my approach. The next time I heard the footsteps start up, I made myself wait until the sound reached what I judged to be the far end of the hallway, right around where that cupboard sat, giving whoever it was plenty of time to actually be standing there in plain sight if it really was my grandfather getting his Tums the normal way. Then I'd open my door. Nothing. Every single time, nothing. Just a dark, empty hallway. No shape standing near the cupboard. No sound of a cupboard door being opened or closed. Nothing at all except silence and darkness, stretching the length of the hallway between my room and theirs. Over time, I got used to it. In the strange, gradual way you get used to almost anything if it happens often enough without ever actually hurting you. The footsteps themselves weren't loud or aggressive. Nothing dramatic or frightening about the sound itself in isolation. Just ordinary feet on ordinary carpet. The kind of sound that could easily be explained away by a dozen mundane possibilities if you weren't paying close enough attention to notice how consistently those explanations failed to hold up. I started assuming, more often than not, that I was probably just half imagining some of it, my sleep-deprived, video game-addled brain filling in sounds that weren't quite as clear or as real as I initially thought they were. It became easier to just ignore it most nights, rather than get up and check every single time, especially since checking never actually produced any answers anyway. I even started making a kind of game out of it in my own head, silently guessing before I opened the door whether it would turn out to be my grandfather this time or nobody at all. Though as the summer went on, nobody at all became the answer far more often than I would have liked. One particular night, though, is the one that has stuck with me clearly ever since, more than any of the others from that summer. I was lying in bed, not doing anything special, just watching television with the volume kept low, the way I did most nights before eventually drifting off. My bed was positioned so that the headboard shared the same wall as my bedroom door, close enough that I could hear pretty much anything happening in the hallway immediately outside without needing to strain to listen for it. That night, I heard the familiar footsteps start up from the far end of the house, moving down the hallway the same way they always did. And I didn't think much of it at first, already so used to the pattern by that point in the summer that it barely registered as anything worth paying close attention to. Could be my grandfather. Could be whatever that other unexplained thing was that I'd stopped being able to catch in the act, no matter how carefully I timed opening my door. Either way, at that point, I mostly just let it happen in the background while I kept half watching whatever was on the television screen. The footsteps continued moving down the hallway, getting closer to my end the way they occasionally did on nights when whoever or whatever was making them didn't stop at the cupboard the way my grandfather normally would. I remember still not thinking much of it, my attention mostly on the television. Some part of my brain simply cataloging the sound the same way it had cataloged dozens of similar sounds over the preceding weeks. The steady rhythm of it continued past the point where it usually paused, past the cupboard, closer and closer to my own door, and some small, distant part of me registered, almost idly, that this particular pass down the hallway was taking a slightly different shape than most of the others had. Then the footsteps stopped, directly outside my door. I remember the exact quality of that silence, sudden and complete, the footsteps simply cutting off mid-stride rather than trailing away the way they normally would if someone had just paused for a moment. My eyes had drifted from the television screen to the door itself without me consciously deciding to look there. Some instinct already anticipating what was coming a half second before it actually happened. And my doorknob started rattling. Not a gentle, normal turn of the handle, the kind you'd expect if someone were simply trying to open the door in an ordinary way. It was a rapid, frantic, clacking kind of motion, the metal knob twisting hard and fast back and forth, again and again, as if someone on the other side were desperately trying to force it open without actually managing to turn it far enough to release the latch. I remember, even in the middle of the fear that gripped me, some small analytical part of my brain noting how wrong the sound felt. Too fast and too mechanical to match the way an actual human hand grips and turns a doorknob, more like something rattling against it from an angle that didn't quite make sense. The sound was loud, sudden, and completely unlike anything I'd heard from that door in all the time I'd been staying in that room, sharp enough to cut straight through whatever half-distracted state I'd drifted into while watching television. For a fraction of a second, I remember genuinely not being able to move at all, frozen in place on the bed. My eyes locked on that rattling doorknob as if watching it happen would somehow make more sense of it than looking away, before whatever instinct finally kicked in and got me moving. I jumped out of bed almost before I'd fully processed what I was hearing, adrenaline shooting through me instantly, and lunged for the door myself, some immediate instinct telling me to catch whoever was on the other side before they had a chance to get away. Part of me, even in that split second of pure reflex, was already constructing an explanation, thinking my grandfather could occasionally be the type to mess with me a little, poking fun the way grandparents sometimes do with teenage grandkids who stay up too late playing video games. And some part of my brain wanted very badly for this to simply be him, standing in the hallway with a grin on his face, having successfully startled me. I remember the television still playing behind me as I crossed the room and what felt like 2 steps, some cartoonish background noise from whatever show I'd had on completely at odds with the pounding of my own heart. And how strange that contrast felt even in the middle of everything else happening. I threw the door open. Nothing. The hallway stretched out in front of me, dark as the middle of the night could possibly make it, completely empty in both directions. No sign of anyone standing there, no sound of anyone hurrying away, no shape ducking into a doorway or around a corner. Just silence, thick and total, pressing in around me while I stood there in the doorway, my heart pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my throat, scanning the empty hallway for any explanation at all for what I'd just heard and felt happening at my own door only seconds earlier. I even checked the linen closet door a few feet away, half convinced somebody might have ducked inside it in the split second between the doorknob going quiet and my own door swinging open, but it sat there, closed and undisturbed, exactly the way it always did. I stood there for a long moment, waiting, half expecting to hear some sound that might explain it. A stifled laugh, a floorboard creaking under someone's shifting weight. Anything at all. Nothing came. The house was completely silent around me. The kind of deep, total silence that somehow feels even more unsettling than noise does, because it leaves you with absolutely nothing to grab onto, nothing to point to and say, there, that's what it was. I remember standing in that doorway barefoot, the carpet cool under my feet, straining my eyes against the darkness of the hallway, trying to convince myself I could make out some shape, some shadow slightly darker than the rest, anything that might explain the sound I had just heard so clearly and so close. There was nothing. Just the ordinary shapes of the hallway itself, the outline of the linen closet door, the faint gleam of the cupboard handle catching what little ambient light made it that far down the hall. Still not fully convinced, still holding on to that last thread of hope that my grandfather was somehow responsible and simply better at hiding than I expected, I made my way carefully down the hallway toward my grandparents' bedroom door, moving slowly in the dark, one hand trailing along the wall to help guide me. I remember the specific texture of that wall under my fingertips, the slightly rough painted drywall cool against my palm, something ordinary and grounding to focus on, while every other part of me stayed tense and alert, half expecting something to reach out of the darkness on either side before I made it the full length of the hallway. I reached their door and opened it slowly, quietly, just enough to peek inside without fully waking either of them if it turned out this really had been nothing more than my imagination getting the better of me after weeks of half-sleepless nights. Both of my grandparents were sound asleep, exactly where they should have been, my grandfather's study. Familiar snoring filling the room the way it did every single night I'd stayed there that summer. Neither of them had moved. Neither of them showed any sign of having just sprinted back into bed after rattling my doorknob and vanishing into thin air before I could get my own door open. I stood there in that doorway for a moment longer than I probably needed to, just listening to that snoring, letting the ordinary, mundane sound of it settle something in my chest that had been wound tight since the moment the doorknob started rattling. My grandmother shifted slightly in her sleep at one point, murmuring something unintelligible before settling back down, and even that small, harmless movement made my whole body go rigid for a second before I registered what it was. I closed their door as quietly as I'd opened it and made my way back down that same dark hallway to my own room, moving a little faster than I had on the way there, without really admitting to myself why. The hallway felt longer on the walk back than it had on the way there, every shadow along the walls seeming to hold just a fraction more weight than it should have. And I remember consciously resisting the urge to break into a full run, some stubborn part of my 13-year-old pride refusing to let whatever was or wasn't out there see me sprint the rest of the way to my own door. I climbed back into bed, pulled the blankets up, and lay there for a good while, with the television still playing quietly, staring at the ceiling, trying to come up with some rational explanation that might actually satisfy me. I never landed on one, not that night, and honestly not in all the years since. I never mentioned it to my grandparents directly, not in any serious way. I think some part of me worried that bringing it up too seriously might make it feel more real than I wanted it to be at 13 or 14 years old, lying awake in an unfamiliar bed in a house that wasn't mine, 3 states away from my actual home. I did mention, offhandedly, over breakfast a few days later, that I thought I'd heard some weird noises in the hallway one night, and my grandmother just gave me this knowing sort of look. The kind adults give each other when they're both thinking the same thing, but have decided not to say it out loud in front of a kid. And told me, in that same offhand tone, that old houses make all kinds of strange sounds at night, nothing to worry about. My grandfather, for his part, just kept eating his cereal, not saying much of anything. Though I remember catching a brief look pass between the two of them before my grandmother changed the subject entirely, asking me instead whether I wanted to help her in the garden later that morning. A question that felt just deliberate enough in its timing that I understood even then that the conversation about the hallway was over whether I wanted it to be or not. Looking back on it now as an adult, I think that was probably the moment I first understood, on some real level, that my grandparents' reputation for ending up in houses with unexplained activity wasn't just an exaggerated family joke passed around at holiday gatherings. There was something genuinely, consistently strange that seemed to follow them from house to house over the years. Something none of the adults in my family ever wanted to discuss too directly or too seriously, always deflecting with a joke or a shrug or a change of subject whenever it came up. I've thought back on that night more times than I can count since then. The sound of those footsteps I'd already half convinced myself were nothing. The sudden violence of that doorknob rattling in a way no ordinary hand turning a doorknob ever would, and the empty hallway waiting for me on the other side of that door, dark and silent, and completely, unnervingly still. Even describing it now, all these years later, I can still feel a faint echo of that same tightness in my chest. The particular kind of fear that comes from being absolutely certain, in the moment, that something was right there, close enough to touch, and then finding nothing at all, waiting for you, once you finally worked up the courage to look. To this day, I still don't have any explanation for what actually happened that night, standing at my bedroom door in that quiet suburban house that looked, from the outside, exactly like every other ordinary house on that street. My grandparents eventually moved again, a few years later, into yet another perfectly normal-looking house that, from what I understand secondhand through other family members, has apparently developed its own set of strange little quirks in the years since they settled in. Footsteps nobody can account for. Doors that don't quite behave the way doors should. I've never asked them directly for the full details. Some part of me, even now, prefers to just let that particular family pattern remain the kind of thing we mention briefly and then move on from quickly, the same way my grandmother did over breakfast that morning, all those years ago, when she told me old houses just make strange sounds at night, and left it at that. I still visit my grandparents fairly often, and I still stay over occasionally, though I notice now, as an adult, that I sleep a little lighter than I used to whenever I'm in one of their houses. Some small, watchful part of my brain never quite fully settling the way it does anywhere else. I've never had another experience as vivid as that doorknob rattling in the middle of the night, not in any of the houses since, but I've heard my share of unexplained footsteps over the years. Enough of them that I've mostly stopped bothering to get up and check anymore. I just lie there in the dark, listening, the same way I did that whole summer, waiting to see whether the sound will simply pass by the way it usually does, or whether, one of these nights, it might stop right outside my door again. My own kids. When they're old enough to visit their great-grandparents and stay overnight themselves, will probably grow up hearing the same family stories I did, the same half-joking warnings about strange sounds in the hallway, and I wonder sometimes whether they'll experience their own version of that summer the way I did, lying awake long past when they should be asleep, listening to footsteps that don't quite add up. We were living with my grandparents at the time, a period of my childhood that carried its own particular texture, the kind of extended family living arrangement that comes with both comfort and a certain unpredictability, depending on which room of the house you happen to find yourself in. Living in that house meant navigating a whole collection of rooms filled with decades of accumulated family history, furniture and objects passed down or collected over the years, some familiar and comforting, others carrying their own small strangeness that a child absorbs without fully questioning at the time. My aunt still lived there too, occupying her own bedroom down the hall, a room I generally avoided entering unless absolutely necessary, mostly because of one specific object that lived inside it, an object that had unsettled me from the very first time I laid eyes on it. In my aunt's room stood a doll, roughly 2 feet tall, styled in an old-fashioned Victorian manner, with a kind of ornate, elaborate clothing and carefully painted features that made it clear this was meant to be a decorative collector's piece, rather than an actual toy meant for children to play with. Its dress was made of some heavy, old-fashioned fabric, layered with lace and small fabric flowers that had probably once looked delicate and charming to whoever originally purchased it. Though to my young eyes it only ever seemed faded and slightly sinister, the kind of ornate detail that somehow made the doll feel even more unsettling rather than more beautiful. At some point, someone had converted this doll into a functioning lamp, wiring it internally so that a small bulb hidden somewhere within its body could be switched on and off through a very particular, very unsettling mechanism. The only way to turn the lamp on was to physically hold the doll's hand, which was made of cold, hard plastic, and raise it upward or lower it back down to switch the light off again. There was no separate switch, no cord you could pull, no ordinary lamp mechanism of any kind. You had to touch the doll directly, had to hold its small, stiff hand in yours, and move its entire arm through that mechanical motion just to get any light out of it. That doll stood permanently on the nightstand beside my aunt's bed, positioned in such a way that it faced directly toward the bedroom door, greeting anyone and everyone who entered the room with an expression that never changed. A smile painted onto its porcelain-like face that always struck me as deeply unsettling rather than warm or welcoming. Its eyes had that particular quality collector's dolls sometimes have, glassy and fixed, giving the unmistakable impression of being watched no matter where exactly you stood in that room. I hated that doll. I hated the way its painted smile never shifted, no matter what was actually happening around it. Hated the particular dead, glassy quality of its eyes. Hated most of all the fact that it stood there permanently facing the door, as though specifically positioned to observe and greet whoever dared to enter. I remember, on more than one occasion, trying to explain to other family members exactly why that doll bothered me so much, struggling to put into words the specific quality of its wrongness beyond simply saying, "It gave me the creeps," a phrase that never quite captured the full weight of what I actually felt whenever I found myself in its presence. As a child, I avoided that room whenever I possibly could. If I needed something from inside, I would try to time my visits for moments when either my aunt or some other adult was already in there with me. Someone whose presence made the doll feel marginally less threatening, simply through the ordinary comfort of not being alone. There is something about shared presence, even silent, unspoken presence, that changes the entire emotional texture of a space. And having another person nearby, even someone not actively paying attention to the doll at all, always made those visits feel more bearable. When that wasn't possible, I developed my own small strategies for minimizing my exposure to it. Moving quickly, avoiding direct eye contact with its painted face, treating every visit into that room like a tactical operation requiring careful planning rather than simply walking in and grabbing whatever I needed. I would map out, mentally, the shortest possible path between the door and whatever object I needed to retrieve, calculating in advance exactly how many steps it would take, exactly which direction I could face to minimize how much of that doll remained within my field of vision throughout the entire process. One day, though, I found myself completely alone in the house, an unusual enough occurrence in a household as full as ours generally was, with my grandparents and various other family members typically coming and going throughout most days. The house rarely feeling genuinely empty, even for short stretches of time. On this particular day, everyone happened to be out simultaneously. Some combination of errands and appointments pulling every single adult out of the house at once, leaving me by myself for a stretch of time that felt strange and unfamiliar precisely because it happened so rarely. At some point during that solitary afternoon, I decided I wanted a blanket that I knew was kept inside my aunt's closet. The afternoon having turned slightly cool despite the daylight still streaming brightly through the windows. I remember standing outside her bedroom door for a moment, working up the nerve to go in, running through my usual mental checklist of precautions before actually stepping across the threshold. Precautions that had become almost ritualistic through years of repetition every time I needed to enter that particular space. There were, at least, two factors working in my favor that particular afternoon, small mercies that made the whole ordeal feel slightly more manageable than it otherwise might have. First, it was the middle of the afternoon, broad daylight streaming through the windows, meaning I had absolutely no need to touch that doll's hand or activate its lamp for any practical purpose whatsoever, sparing me at least from the worst part of any typical visit to that room. Second, the closet itself was located immediately beside the door, close enough that I calculated I could complete the entire mission, entering the room, retrieving the blanket, and exiting again, without ever needing to walk deep into the space where the doll's presence would feel most oppressive, without ever needing to pass anywhere near that nightstand at all. Armed with this small plan, I devised what felt at the time like a genuinely clever strategy. The kind of careful, deliberate scheme that only a frightened child could take so seriously. I would keep my eyes fixed firmly on the floor the entire time, avoiding any direct visual contact with the doll altogether, and simply navigate the short distance to the closet purely through spatial memory and peripheral awareness rather than actually looking directly at anything in the room, especially not that painted, watching face perched on the nightstand. I had walked through that exact layout enough times before that I felt genuinely confident I could complete the whole maneuver without ever needing to lift my gaze from the floor even once. So, staring resolutely at the floor the entire time, I pushed the door open and stepped inside, immediately turning 180 degrees so that my back was now facing directly toward the nightstand and, by extension, directly toward the doll itself. With my back turned firmly away from it, I felt marginally safer, marginally more in control of the situation. Even though logically I understood that a stationary doll couldn't actually see me or do anything, regardless of which direction I happened to be facing. Still, there is a particular kind of childhood logic that operates independently of adult rationality, and in that moment, having my back turned felt like a genuine, meaningful form of protection, as though simply removing that painted face from my direct line of sight was somehow enough to neutralize whatever unease it stirred up in me. I quickly swung open the closet door, still keeping my gaze low, still refusing to look anywhere near that nightstand, and reached down toward the shelf where I knew the blankets were kept. My fingers found the fabric I was looking for, and I was just about to pull it free and make my quick exit from the room when something shifted. Something changed about the quality of the space around me in a way I registered before I could even fully process what it was. The room had gotten brighter, not dramatically, not in any way that would have been obvious if I hadn't already been so acutely, nervously attuned to every small detail of that space, but noticeably brighter, nonetheless, as though an additional light source had somehow activated somewhere behind me, while my attention remained fixed on the closet shelf in front of me. I remember the fine, nearly invisible hairs on the back of my neck rising up in that instant, that particular physical sensation that arrives instinctively whenever something primal within you recognizes danger before your conscious mind has fully caught up to explain exactly why. A sensation I have only ever felt a handful of other times in my life since, none of them quite matching the intensity of that particular afternoon. I froze completely still, blanket half pulled from the shelf, my whole body locked in place by a fear I couldn't yet fully articulate or justify. My hand remained gripped around the fabric, fingers curled tight, my breath catching somewhere in my throat and refusing to release properly. Logically, rationally, I understood on some level that lights sometimes flicker, that electrical quirks exist in old houses, That there could be a dozen mundane explanations for a room suddenly seeming brighter than it had a moment before. But none of that rational calculation managed to override the pure animal terror that had taken hold of my entire body in that instant, holding me completely motionless for what felt in memory like an absolute eternity, though it was probably only a handful of seconds in reality. Every part of me wanted desperately to believe it was nothing, that my mind was simply playing tricks born out of years of accumulated unease around that specific object. And yet, some deeper, more primal part of me refused to accept that comforting explanation, insisting instead that something had genuinely, undeniably changed in that room while my back remained turned. Eventually, my survival instinct kicked in, pushing hard against the frozen paralysis that had gripped me, urging my body to simply run, to bolt from that room screaming without bothering to look back or investigate further, to prioritize immediate physical escape over any need for confirmation about what exactly had changed behind me. Every reasonable impulse in my young mind was telling me to do exactly that, to flee first and process the details later, safely, from a distance, once I was well away from whatever was happening in that bedroom. I could feel my legs tensing, preparing to carry me forward toward the door in a single, desperate burst of motion. My entire body already leaning slightly in that direction, even as some other, more stubborn part of me held me back for just a moment longer. But before I could fully commit to that plan of pure, unquestioning flight, some other part of me, some deeply unfortunate, curious impulse, insisted that I needed to look first, needed to actually turn around and confirm with my own eyes what exactly had shifted in that room before I allowed myself to run. That particular impulse has always struck me, in hindsight, as one of the strangest and most self-destructive instincts a frightened child can possess. This need to confirm visually the exact nature of a threat before allowing yourself to flee from it, as though somehow half information would be more unbearable than full confirmation, even when that confirmation might turn out to be far worse than anything the imagination alone could have conjured. Looking back now, as an adult, I genuinely wish that particular impulse had never surfaced in me that day. I wish, more than almost anything else from my childhood, that I had simply trusted my initial survival instinct completely and fled that room without ever turning my head, without ever confirming visually what my body had already sensed had changed. As I turned to make my exit from the room, blanket clutched tightly in my hands, I made the catastrophic mistake of lifting my head, of finally allowing my gaze to travel upward from the floor toward the nightstand where that doll had stood the entire time, silent and stationary throughout my brief visit. And there, exactly as my instincts had already warned me, the lamp was on. The small bulb hidden somewhere inside that porcelain body glowed steadily, casting its particular light across the room in a way that confirmed, beyond any possibility of rational denial, that something had physically interacted with that doll's hand while my back was turned, raising it into the exact position required to complete the electrical circuit and activate the light. The light itself seemed strange in that moment, not harsh or bright exactly, but somehow wrong in its steady, patient glow, illuminating the doll's painted face in a way that made its unchanging smile seem even more deliberate and knowing than it ever had before. And its hand, that small, cold, plastic hand that could only be moved through direct physical contact and deliberate manipulation, was raised, pointed directly at me. I remember staring at that raised arm for what felt like an unbearably long moment, my mind refusing at first to fully accept what my eyes were clearly showing me. Some part of me still desperately searching for an alternative explanation, even as the evidence stood there directly in front of me, undeniable and impossible in equal measure. I don't have adequate words, even now, all these years later, to fully describe the particular quality of terror that gripped me in that exact moment. It wasn't simply fear of the doll itself, wasn't simply the ordinary unease I had always carried around that specific object, even under normal circumstances. It was something deeper, something that reached all the way down into whatever primal part of the human brain is responsible for recognizing genuine wrongness, genuine violation of the fundamental rules that are supposed to govern how the physical world operates. That lamp required deliberate, physical manipulation to activate. Someone, or something, had to have physically grasped that doll's hand and raised it while I stood with my back turned only a few feet away, completely alone in an otherwise empty house. I don't remember the specific details of leaving that room, don't remember the exact sequence of my footsteps carrying me away from that nightstand and that impossibly raised hand pointed directly toward where I had been standing. My memory of the immediate aftermath exists mostly as a blur of pure adrenaline and terror, my body apparently taking over completely from whatever conscious, rational thought process might otherwise have guided my actions in that moment. I know I made it out of that room. I know I eventually found myself somewhere else in the house, breathing hard, blankets still clutched tightly against my chest, though the specific transition between those two states remains largely lost to memory, swallowed up by the overwhelming intensity of what I had just witnessed. I was 13 years old when this happened, an age already prone to heightened imagination and exaggerated fears under ordinary circumstances. The kind of age where every creak in an old house can feel loaded with sinister possibility, even without any additional supernatural encouragement. Where shadows in hallways and unfamiliar sounds after dark already carry an outsized emotional weight in a young mind still learning to distinguish real danger from ordinary imagination. But this particular experience felt different from any ordinary childhood fear I had previously carried. Felt distinctly separate from the kind of imaginative anxiety that typically fades naturally with time and adult perspective. This memory has never faded that way, not in the slightest. If anything, it has only grown more vivid and more disturbing the more I have reflected on it over the years since. Examined from every possible angle an adult mind can bring to bear on a childhood memory, and it has never once softened into something I could comfortably dismiss as simple imagination or exaggeration. I have tried, many times over the years, to construct some kind of rational explanation for what happened that afternoon. I have wondered whether perhaps some mechanical quirk in the lamp's internal wiring could have caused it to activate on its own, some short circuit or malfunction that might explain the light turning on without requiring the hand to actually be physically raised by an outside force. I have even looked into, out of pure curiosity born from years of turning this story over in my mind, how these kinds of novelty lamp mechanisms typically function, trying to understand whether there might be some obscure electrical explanation I simply hadn't considered as a frightened 13-year-old standing in that room. But that explanation has never fully satisfied me, has never adequately accounted for the specific, undeniable fact that the hand itself, the actual physical arm of that doll, had visibly moved into the raised position required to complete the mechanism. An outcome that simply could not occur through electrical malfunction alone, given how the lamp's design specifically required physical manipulation of the arm itself rather than any kind of internal switch or automatic trigger. I have also considered, at various points over the years, whether perhaps I had simply misremembered some detail, whether my 13-year-old mind, already primed with fear and anxiety about that particular object, might have unconsciously exaggerated or distorted what I actually witnessed in that room. Memory is notoriously unreliable, especially memory formed during moments of intense emotional stress, and I try to remain honest with myself about that possibility whenever I revisit this particular story, especially now that I understand, as an adult, just how easily fear can shape and reshape our recollection of frightening events over time. But even accounting for that uncertainty, even allowing for the possibility that some small details might have shifted slightly in my memory over the intervening years, the core, essential facts of what happened have never wavered in my mind. The lamp turned on while my back was turned. The hand was raised, and it was pointed directly toward me. I never told my aunt about what happened that day. Not directly. Not in any detailed way that might have prompted uncomfortable questions about why exactly I refused to enter her room alone from that point forward. I simply began finding additional excuses to avoid that particular bedroom whenever possible, developing new strategies beyond my previous ones, strategies specifically designed around never again finding myself alone in that space with my back turned toward that nightstand for any length of time whatsoever. If I needed something from her room after that day, I made absolutely certain that someone else was present with me, that I was never again isolated in that space the way I had been on that particular afternoon. I became, in the months and years that followed, almost obsessively careful about avoiding any situation that might require me to repeat that specific set of circumstances, always finding some excuse, some small delay, some request for company that would prevent history from repeating itself. That doll remained in my aunt's room for years afterward, as far as I know, continuing its silent vigil on that nightstand, greeting anyone who entered with that same fixed, painted smile, that same unchanging, glassy stare. I have no idea whether anyone else in my family ever experienced anything similar with it, whether my aunt herself ever noticed anything unusual during the countless nights she presumably spent sleeping in that same room, mere feet away from that object. I never worked up the courage to ask her directly, worried that voicing my own experience out loud might somehow make it feel more real, more permanent, more difficult to eventually convince myself had simply been some strange trick of childhood imagination and fear. There is a particular kind of protection in silence, sometimes, a way of keeping an experience contained and manageable simply by refusing to give it voice, and I think, looking back, that this was exactly the kind of protective silence I was seeking during those years. Looking back now, as a fully grown adult with decades of additional life experience and perspective informing how I process memories like this one, I still find myself unable to fully explain away what happened in that room. I have encountered plenty of skeptics over the years when I have occasionally shared this story. People quick to offer alternative, rational explanations. People convinced that some combination of childhood fear, faulty memory, and simple electrical malfunction must account for everything I experienced that day. Some have suggested I simply misjudged the room's brightness in the first place, that perhaps the lamp had been on before I even entered, and I had simply failed to notice in my nervousness. Others have proposed that maybe a gust of wind or some structural vibration within the old house could have jostled the doll's arm loose enough to trigger the mechanism, though nobody has ever quite managed to explain how a stationary plastic arm, weighted down by its own mechanism, could plausibly rise into that precise upright position through vibration alone rather than deliberate manipulation. I understand their skepticism completely, and on my more rational days, I sometimes find myself leaning toward those same explanations myself, trying to reassure my adult mind that surely there must be some ordinary, mundane cause behind what felt, in the moment, like something genuinely impossible. It would certainly be easier, in many ways, to simply file this memory away alongside other ordinary childhood fears, harmless and easily explained once viewed through the clearer, calmer lens of adulthood. But then I close my eyes, and I am back there again, 13 years old, standing in that closet with my back turned, feeling that unmistakable shift in the room's brightness, feeling those hairs rise on the back of my neck in that particular way that only ever seems to happen when something has gone genuinely, fundamentally wrong. And I remember, with a clarity that has never once dimmed despite all the years that have passed since, turning around and seeing that small plastic hand raised exactly as high as the mechanism allowed, pointed with what felt like unmistakable, deliberate precision directly toward the spot where I had been standing only moments before. I have thought, on occasion, about what that doll might have been trying to communicate through that gesture, assuming for a moment that there was genuine intention behind what happened rather than simple electrical malfunction. Was it some kind of warning, some attempt to alert me to a danger I wasn't otherwise aware of in that moment? Was it simply an assertion of presence, a way of confirming that whatever inhabited that object, whether some lingering spirit attached to the doll itself or something else entirely, wanted me to know unmistakably that I had been watched the entire time? Regardless of how carefully I had avoided direct eye contact or kept my back turned throughout my visit, I have turned these questions over so many times in the years since that they have started to feel almost like old, familiar companions. Questions I return to periodically without ever expecting to finally arrive at a satisfying answer. I have never settled on any single satisfying answer to those questions, and I suspect at this point that I never fully will. What I do know, with complete certainty regardless of how many years pass or how many rational explanations I encounter from skeptical friends and family members, is exactly what I witnessed that afternoon. The lamp was off when I entered that room. My back was turned the entire time I retrieved that blanket from the closet. Every muscle in my body tense with the familiar discomfort that space always produced in me. And when I finally turned around against every rational instinct telling me to simply flee without looking, I saw that small, cold, plastic hand raised into position, pointed directly at me. The lamp glowing steadily behind it in a room that had been completely dark, completely inactive. Just moments before, everything about that image seared permanently into a corner of my memory that has never once dulled with age. That image has remained burned into my memory ever since that particular afternoon, refusing to fade the way most ordinary childhood fears eventually do with time and distance. Even now, decades later, if I allow my mind to drift back toward that specific memory, I still feel an echo of that same primal terror rising up in my chest. That same instinctive recognition that something had happened in that room which simply should not have been possible, according to any ordinary understanding of how the physical world operates. I have long since moved out of my grandparents' house, long since lost track of whatever eventually became of that particular doll and its unsettling lamp mechanism, but the memory itself has never loosened its grip on me, remaining exactly as vivid and exactly as disturbing today as it was on the actual afternoon it happened. All those years ago, when I was still just a frightened 13-year-old girl who made the terrible mistake of turning around to look, I sometimes wonder, in idle moments, what might have happened if I had simply trusted my first instinct and run without ever looking back, whether that particular image would have haunted me any less had I never actually confirmed with my own eyes exactly what had changed in that room. Perhaps, in some alternate version of that afternoon, I would have spent years afterward wondering, guessing, imagining various possibilities without ever settling on one definitive, unshakable memory. Instead, I carry this specific image with me, crystal clear and unyielding. A small plastic hand raised in the golden afternoon light, pointed with what still feels, even now, like unmistakable intention, directly toward the frightened child standing across the room. Whatever explanation eventually proves true, whatever combination of electrical malfunction, childhood imagination, or something genuinely unexplainable actually accounts for what happened that day, I doubt I will ever fully stop feeling that same small chill whenever I think back on that Victorian doll standing silently on its nightstand, waiting, always waiting for someone to walk through that door.